Subscribe and click the notification bell to make 2019 the scariest year on record. 2018 was quite the creepy year. I read easily over 1,000 of your stories, I think. And that's just for my subscribers. Imagine how many other untold horrors are waiting to be shared. So, to celebrate this new year, maybe a little late, and for all the spooks that were had last year, I've compiled a list of the top 25 scariest true stories from 2018 with your help. These stories were suggested by you, the viewer, while a few of them were my favorites. I hope you enjoy the stories, whether you've heard them before or not, and make sure to click the link in the description below at any time to download this episode as an ad-free MP3 to listen to it anywhere on the go. As always, you can share your scary stories with us at darknessprevails.org. Stories submitted there have a chance to appear in new episodes. Also, before we begin, take a moment to leave a like on this video to help us reach 2,000 likes, or wait to the end to see if I've earned your like. Thank you. Something's Down There, submitted by Fat Rabbit 61614. Back when I was young, I used to live near a huge river situated under a gorge. Well, not exactly near. It was technically a street and a field away, but that didn't stop me and my cousins from going there to explore, much to the dismay of our overprotective parents. Especially when I tell you why. This story isn't so much about me, but about my uncle who lived particularly close to the river. He was an outdoorsman, but the one with nature type. You can tell from his tanned, muscular body that this guy has done his fair share of manual labor, and he has the power and skills to prove it. Anyway, his particular hobby was fishing, and not in the traditional boat and reel kind. He and some of his buddies did so by taking the inner tube of what looked like a truck tire and used it as a flotation device. They would lay on top of it while they paddled and dragged a net around. For some reason, this works because, as he said, fish aren't as spooked by what would appear as flotsam to them. Incidentally, this is how he primarily provided for his family. This was the best way he knew how. The river itself was pretty wide, with foot-deep shallow parts that most people can walk straight through to the other side on. The current on these parts weren't very strong, and the sediment was very solid, so you had no real danger of slipping or getting stuck. But other parts were deep as 25 feet, and very murky. These were where the current was strangely powerful. Incidentally, these were the parts that my uncle and his buddies fished at. Now, it won't come as any surprise that some people have drowned in this river. Heck, that's what our parents back then were so afraid of, because we were just small kids near a really dangerous expanse of water. And of course, there were other stories, cautionary tales. One in particular came from my uncle himself, about a child who swam around the deep parts and was suddenly pulled under. Not swept away by the current, not cramps or anything like that, but dragged down. He would play up this story by saying it was a shokoi, a malevolent merman who prowls deep water for people to drown. Of course, only the most impressionable of us kids believed him, until he himself had his own personal story to tell. And he did tell us, hesitantly. This is how his story went. One day, he was fishing with two of his friends, and like always, they were at the deep, murky part of the river. That day, the current was pretty strong, but their inner tubes were anchored on the riverbank, so they weren't particularly getting dragged too far from their spots. But at a certain point, he was beginning to get distanced from the others because his rope anchor was too long. He says that after a while, he felt his inner tube jolt harder than what the current was capable of. He tried to steady himself as best he could, but the more he fidgeted around to balance himself, the more it got more difficult to do so. Then, he suddenly fell off. No, what he told us was that he felt his inner tube was pulled off right from under him, something the current wasn't capable of. Instantly, he was underwater, and while this was nothing new, he was a great swimmer after all. He felt something weighing him down. He couldn't see very well through the murky water, but he swears he saw some dark shadow around his legs, tugging at his ankles, preventing him from kicking up and treading water. The fact that he had little time to draw breath before he went under was not making it any easier. Fortunately, one of his friends saw him go under, and when he saw my uncle thrash about a little, which they said he never does because that would spook the fish, he quickly went closer and yanked my uncle up to the surface level. With the help of his friend, my uncle was able to kick free from the creature that was holding on to him, and they all went back to the riverbank to rest. When asked what happened, all my uncle told his friends was that something had pulled him down, and he had no idea what it was. When my uncle looked at his leg, he saw cut marks on his ankles, like claws that were forced to let go. It was then that they decided that that was enough fishing for one day, and they retreated back to much more solid ground. Needless to say, that story was more than enough to scare me, the more sensible of us kids, into not going to the river, especially when the current was too strong. If someone like my uncle, who practically grew up in the water, nearly lost his life to it, what chance did we have? Of course, that wasn't the end of it, because over the years, we still heard about more people drowning in that river under mysterious circumstances. My uncle still fishes there today, but at his age, he's more than glad to stay on dry land and just use a fishing rod. Even still, he always avoids the spot he almost got dragged under to his doom. "There's something down there," he said, "and I'm not gonna tempt it to try again." The Invisible Creature, submitted by Gothica1. I debated on even sharing this story, simply because I'm not really sure what to call it. I'm no stranger to the tales of the paranormal or cryptids, and normally I can label something when someone talks about it, or if I see something myself. But this one, it really messes with me, and even worse, I think it's trying to hurt people. You see, where I work, there's an attic. Not a creepy, dimly lit, dirty attic. This one is quite large, well lit, clean, the last setting for a horror film you would think of. There is heavy metal racking that is empty a good part of the year that have steel grids on them. They are heavy enough to hold over a ton, but still loose enough that if you ran on them, they would move and rattle and make noise. Now, the attic has its fair share of awkward things that I could write about, including at one point what I believe was a poltergeist. But this is not the story that I'm sharing. It's not just limited to the attic area, but it is an important factor. So here goes. It was a few months ago. It was after closing time the first time it happened. I had to go out into the courtyard to put up signs for the next day. The courtyard has a heavy metal ceiling about 2 stories up, mind you. As I walked to the first automatic door, it opened well before the sensor could have picked me up, and it just stood there, open. Something in my head said not to continue further. A wave of unease hit me. It didn't feel like the paranormal feels, because I've had similar experiences like that. No, this was different, and it made me nervous. I chose to walk the extra yard to the other door. It was closer to where I needed to put the sign in the dimly lit yard. As I got close to the door, like the other door, it opened much before I ever got close to it. It was like there was something there that I couldn't see. Then it closed, and I cleared my thoughts and went into the courtyard. I had to put the signs out if I wanted to go home, and it was getting late, later by the second. I went out there, and I felt like I was being watched from the ceiling, and as I walked, I could hear something was moving on the high metal beams. It sounded like talons raking against the metal. When I looked up, I saw nothing. No birds, no figures, no shadows, just pure white beams with nothing on them. I put the last sign up, and I could hear that something still following me from above. I began to quicken my pace to the door, and suddenly, I heard the shipper of heavy boxes a few feet behind me. It was making noises like something massive had fallen on it or jumped down from above. I looked at the shipper, and indeed there was a huge indent on it that wasn't there before. Faster I moved, but I kept myself from running. As I walked back to where my other coworkers waited for me, I heard the doors open behind me, but there was nothing there. I was very chilled for the rest of the night, and afraid to tell my coworkers what I actually saw, or I guess didn't see. The next day I worked, I had chosen to push the strange incident from my mind, trying to shake it off as some sort of unusual daydream or hallucination. The day went by like normal for the first few hours, but I had to run some things up to the attic, choosing to take the elevator for easier and faster transfer. I remember hearing the same metal and claws combination as I began to head upstairs, as if it was following me in the underbelly of the attic stairs. It legitimately paused when I looked towards the sound, and would only resume when I continued walking, facing away from it. I decided to keep focused and not dwell on it. I've learned dwelling on something seems to make it more curious in you, no matter what it is. I went upstairs and began sorting through the items I needed to. I heard something come up the stairs, but I saw nothing there. I remember feeling that something was perched on one of the beams near me. It was like if I really wanted to see it, I would. Like whatever it was really wanted me to see it. It was a strange feeling of terrifying tug-of-war in my mind. I told myself to ignore it, but there was something else in my head, something that wasn't my own really, screaming at me, saying, "See me, look at me." But I ignored it. My whole body felt like it was itching to run, like my instincts wanted to kick in at any moment to survive. But I knew I couldn't. I walked back to the elevator, and I kid you not, the partisan visibly moved, like something large was running along the heavy metal shelves. The racking was actually moving, like something's weight was pushing it down. Something invisible was following me. When I got to the elevator, heart pounding in my chest, I heard it hit the wooden ground in front of the elevator door, and then the elevator shifted. I stood there, focusing on the doors, but I knew that it was now in there with me. I felt it hovering near me, over me, waiting for me to freak out or look at it. Instead, for some unknown reason, to this day I can't even explain it, I reached out for where I felt it was without looking. I tried to touch it. I'm not joking when I felt the elevator shift, like something large had back away suddenly and hit the wall as the doors opened. I walked out at a quick pace, and since then I haven't heard or felt anything more, and I've said nothing to my coworkers still. But unfortunately, I highly doubt the thing is gone. Because since then, there have been a ridiculous number of injuries upstairs that no one can figure out. I myself got my hand nearly broken by beams that fell at random. Another coworker's experience was even weirder, saying he had tripped over something on the ground that was large, something he didn't see but felt like flesh and muscle. When he fell down off the racking, he busted his kneecap, and most recently and disturbingly, one of my coworkers was put in the hospital for a few days. She's suffering permanent brain damage. Her name is Luna. Another coworker named Anna witnessed what happened to her and is still so shaken she can't explain it or figure it out. This is how she explains what she saw. She saw Luna stand up from working, and as soon as she stood up, she saw her head forcefully be slammed into the metal beams next to her. Luna was fine for a few seconds, and then her eyes went wide, and she tried to step away from the beam in what looked like fear. Anna said she looked like she tripped, but as she focused on it, it looked like Luna was slammed into the wall by something. Anna hasn't been the same since, and she won't go up there alone. I'm not sure if it's the same thing I dealt with, but I'm afraid it's getting more brazen. Something tells me it's no ghost, no haunting. This is something else entirely, and it's extremely dangerous. Wolf creature. From A. and Remy. Location: Colorado. This happened about 2 years ago in the Uncompahgre National Forest near my home. I had my 7-year-old Labrador Retriever with me while I was hiking on this particular evening in late August. I was going through a hard time and went hiking a lot to clear my head during that time. I had been hiking for about 4 hours without seeing anything but a few chipmunks and a black bear. My lab was trotting beside me happily, excited just to be outside, when we decided to stop along the canyon ridge for some water and some dinner that I had packed for the two of us. His was a can of dog food, but I had made myself a nice spread of cheese, crackers, a turkey sandwich, and some apple juice. When we had finished with our dinner, I began to tell him what I was thinking about, like problems with friends, as I had a rough time in high school, and my lab was my closest friend. "Come on, old pal," I said to him. "Let's head back to the car." He leapt up happily and began to trot beside me. We didn't make it a mile before a feeling washed over me. I was being watched. By what, I thought. There wouldn't be anyone out here for miles, I reminded myself. That's when my lab's ears perked up. He began a low growl. "Remy, boy, what's the matter?" The fur stood up on his whole back, the way he does when he's angry or scared. He started to run, and I chased after him, calling and calling. He never ever disobeyed a callback, so this worried me. I then began to hear heavy footsteps running from his barking. He was chasing something. "Remington, get back here," I yelled after him. When I finally caught up with him, the mutt had every single fur standing on end, teeth bared, and growling at a large dog. Sure, he would give chase to creatures all the time, but never had he been so aggressive before. I looked at the larger dog after I put Remy back on his leash. It wasn't a normal dog. This one was huge, with dark fur and a single silver spot over its eye. I immediately thought wolf. Its legs were muscular, the muzzle covered in dried red. The head was up to my chin on all fours, and the creature had red glaring eyes. I slowly began to back away from the wolf, saying, "It's okay," to it. "I'm not here to hurt you. We're going now." The animal took a step towards us. My eyes went wide as saucers. Remy growled and jumped from his leash at the wolf, catching me off guard. That's when I felt more disturbed than ever. Startled, the wolf-like creature stood up on hind legs. Muscles that I could see better now rippled and flexed, Its legs looked human almost, and the chest was like a grown man's, covered in hair. The thing bared its teeth and looked directly at me. Remy cowered behind me, now whining and whimpering. We were both terrified. The creature towered over us and snapped its teeth at me. It began to sniff me and Remy, circling us slowly. I couldn't move at all, even when the creature touched its muzzle to my back, sniffing at me. The creature began to wail, rearing its head back. I remember thinking that these are my final moments. Maybe it's calling others to help eat me. I looked down at my terrified dog. We reached an agreement. I shoved at the creature as hard as I could, causing it to fall over, which is easier for things on two legs, and we ran. I ran like I would never see tomorrow, and Remy kept pace with me. "Come on, buddy," I said to him. I could feel the heavy footsteps of that animal behind me. I pushed and ran faster, faster. I made it to the road and looked back. That was a big mistake. The creature was no more than 10 feet behind us, sprinting at full speed. That's when I hear it, a truck, a large semi, coming towards us on the road. I kept running until I saw it. Then I turned again. The creature was now gone, probably scared from the sound of the loud machinery. I ran until we reached the car and I threw the backpack in. Remy jumped inside. We thundered down the road at about 45 miles an hour. Any faster and we surely would have crashed. There was a horrible howling sound booming from the forest, and the creature returned in the rearview mirror, pursuing us again. I couldn't go any faster. We cracked around curves and hit potholes. I thanked God my car was high-rise. It was only 3 feet behind us at one point. I could hear the pause over the engine. That's when we hit the pavement instead of dirt. I sped up to 60 miles an hour. We lost the creature, and I continued down the road back to my house. When we finally made it there, we got inside, both of us shaking. My parents asked what had happened. I told them that we were chased by a bear. It wasn't entirely false, as we did see a black bear, and we were chased by something. Remy and I eventually calmed down enough to go to sleep. I woke up at 2 a.m. because I had to use the bathroom. I began to get out of bed when I heard a familiar growl outside my window. Oh God, I thought. I heard footsteps and a ripping sound, as if there were claws sliding down the siding of the house. I was terrified, but Remy stayed silent, shaking like he had been before. I slid out of bed and I walked to the door, keeping an eye on my window the entire time. The growl deepened, and eventually the creature roared, pounding 3 times on the wall. I screamed and ran into the living room, waking my family. My dad grabbed a 12 gauge and ran outside, but the creature was gone. But there were remnants of it, because the siding on the side of the house had deep scratches on it, 2 feet to the right of my bedroom window. I've since moved out from my parents' place. Remy and I don't go hiking in the Uncompahgre anymore, and I've never seen the creature again. Some part of me does want to go back, try to see it again, but I know better than that, so I steer clear of those woods. If you're ever in the Uncompahgre, beware of the Spring Creek trails. Call me weird or accuse me of defeating the purpose, but whenever I go hiking or camping, I bring a pair of Sony headphones and my smartphone to watch my favorite YouTube channels, and maybe some Netflix or Hulu. Sure, I've nearly walked into a tree a few times, but when you work 12 hours a day, 4 days a week, it can be difficult to find all the time you need to catch up on the videos you enjoy, while also finishing errands and getting outside. The thing is, though, I haven't gone outside wearing headphones for the past year now, and I don't think I ever will again, because something happened to me that was so traumatizing. I nearly never went back in the woods at all. It was July 7th of 2017. I had planned to camp out that day as I had Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays off. It was supposed to be simple and fun. Leave Friday evening, enjoy a Saturday in the woods alone, and come home Sunday so I could get enough sleep for another 12-hour shift on Monday. By 4:30 p.m. that day, I had everything packed, and all my errands had been run for the weekend. It was time to get outdoors and catch up on an overflowing subscription feed near a crackling campfire. Up in those mountains, things are always quiet. I live very close to a highway in the city, so you can imagine how much of a respite it is for me to relax in a place where you can actually hear your ears ringing. I hiked for half an hour before reaching my pre-planned campground, a small clearing surrounded by tall conifers. There was shade and plenty of moist leaves on the ground, and to me that was perfection. I began to pull the bag off of my back and unroll the tent. As I was setting up my nylon shelter, I suddenly froze. I felt something, a strange sensation on the back of my neck. It felt like breathing. Counting down in my head, 3, 2, 1. I then turned around. All I saw around me was forest, empty, silent forest. I sighed and rubbed the newly formed goosebumps on the back of my neck. I then turned back toward the unfinished tent. That was weird. It was all I had to say about it. The sun was setting by the time the fire was going. It crackled in front of me, my back to the trees and the tent on the opposite side. I had a single headphone over my head, the other hanging toward the back of my scalp. I was finally able to relax and enjoy myself. I pulled up my subscription feed on the YouTube app. Then I kicked off my nighttime bug repellent-fueled binge. First up was Dude Perfect. I can't remember the precise video it was, but I do remember just letting it play for a while. I was soon distracted from my sub-feed and ended up watching overdramatic bottle flip videos. That's YouTube for you. But that peace didn't last long. I must have been watching videos for about 40 minutes when I found myself petrified, motionless, frozen to my sitting position. I was supposed to be alone in these woods. I hadn't invited anyone out here, nor had I told anyone that I was going camping this weekend. So, when I felt it, I felt like my heart was going to evaporate. There were hands creeping over my shoulders. I remember thinking in my panic, who and why? I remember thinking how much I regretted pointing my back toward the woods. Whoever these hands belonged to, they were icy cold. Every centimeter of their dry, cracked flesh stung like tiny angry waves of red ants. Somehow, I could not move, or I just simply refused to move. In the back of my mind, I knew that jumping or turning around all of a sudden would force my attacker into view. And at that moment, I did not want to see who or what those hands belonged to. They creeped over my shoulders until they were coming down toward my chest. By then, I could see pale white skin and yellow chipped fingernails. They scraped over the outside of my plaid shirt. Nothing had ever felt so gentle, yet so treacherous at the same time. Its movement along my shivering body left a trail of goose flesh. Seconds later, there was a new sensation on the back of my neck, a sensation that was terrifyingly similar to breathing, except these breaths were cold and dry. What must have been 20 seconds spanned eons. Every palpitation of my heart felt like a battering ram against my trembling ribcage. What was I supposed to do? What would a person do in that situation when they missed the opportunity to jump away? When they allowed themselves to be encompassed by an unseen entity in the middle of miles upon miles of wilderness? Shaking violently now, I began to flex my arms. I lifted them slowly. My target, the headphones on my head. I will remove them, I thought, and then ask my invader what they wanted from me. My heart pounded somehow harder now, only a few more inches, and then my hands would meet my headphones. The sound of the video playing on my smartphone had now been drowned out by the red noise of blood rushing through my veins. My hands finally met my headphones. I reminded myself I just had to yank them off. Another countdown. 3, 2, 1. I tugged the plastic arch from my head and jumped over the campfire in one spry motion. Turning toward my previous resting place, I breathed in hard. Where I was once sitting only remained struggling shadows lapping at the light of the flickering campfire, and beyond that, trees swayed only just barely in the light wind. What? I breathed out loud. Was it a dream? My mind raced to capture an excuse, but I could find none. After the denial, I found anger as I berated myself. Wearing headphones in the woods, assuming I was completely safe. If I hadn't been deafened by these headphones, I would have at least heard the assailant enter my camp. But what assailant? Whoever they were gone now, leaving me flustered and considering the idea of just abandoning my weekend plans. I crawled into my tent and sat facing the small opening, the fire still brightly alive in front of me. I stayed awake and aware for the next 2 hours. It took me that long to convince myself that what I just experienced was just a hallucination or something. Yeah, just a hallucination, brought on by exhaustion from the long work week and treacherous hike, and aided by me wearing headphones to listen to miscellaneous tripe on the internet. Having thoroughly persuaded myself that there was nothing to worry about, I laid back, still facing the opening of the tent, where the fire could be seen outside. Then I went back to taking in my sub-feed. Shane Dawson began to pour in through my headphones. I was warm, comfortable, and entertained. It was only a matter of minutes before I fell asleep. I don't know what woke me up. My right hand was still propping up my smartphone, which by then had strayed quite far from my subscription feed again. I must have been out for an hour or so. It was still dark out. Actually, it was darker now, as the flames of the fire that once imbued my tent with warmth and a secure glow had died down to not more than orange radiating embers. It gave off some light though, enough light for me to see that I was not alone. I held my breath. The sound of me breathing in would surely give me away. That is, if they didn't already know I was there. Sitting on the opposite side of the campfire was a small, feminine figure. She seemed to shake a bit every few seconds. Because of her dirty, mud-covered hair hanging in front of her face, I could not make out much more than her kneeling, quivering shape. She wasn't wearing clothes, from what I could tell, but the mud on her body had long since dried, forming a body paint-like covering about her. She could have been looking at me, and I wouldn't have been able to tell. Realizing that my headphones were still on, I quietly removed them and realized that it wasn't as silent as it appeared. Every time the girl shook, she moaned a raspy cry. She had been sobbing this whole time. This dirty, strange little girl was in my camp sobbing in the middle of the forest. My fear subsided for a moment. Human instinct kicked in as I wondered if this poor girl needed help. Perhaps she was the source of my fears from before, and my sudden jump had scared her back into the woods. Driven by guilt and anxiety, I pulled myself up, placing my smartphone and headphones beside me. But when my shoulder rubbed against the side of the tent, her face immediately cocked up. She was looking straight at me. Her face shone clearly in the embers' glow. I screamed. The girl had only eyes. No mouth, no nose, just eyes that poured tears over her far too smooth face. I was crawling backward now, hitting the back wall of the tent. I ended up tearing a hole through it to get away desperately from her. Clumsily, I got myself stuck in the hole, and I struggled for a bit before standing outside the remnants of the shelter. I turned toward the girl, but she was gone now. She had disappeared, yet her cries remained in the air. They echoed distantly through the trees around me. The sobbing now sounded as if it were miles away. There was no possible way I could make sense of this situation, and all my mind could compel me to do was flee, escape. So I gave in. I made it back to my car without any further incidents, without any further life-shattering sounds or sights. Relief was the only sensation left in me. Everything was numb now. I just wanted to go home. After this experience, I'd need a whole new weekend, just to escape this failure of a weekend. As I climbed into my car and put the keys into the ignition, I looked up. No, I didn't see the girl again, nor did I hear her anymore. But that was when I did realize something. I'd forgotten my phone and headphones in my rush. The ruins of my tent were there too, an epitome of my experience. I floored the gas pedal and didn't let up until I made it home. I haven't planned any further trips into the woods, and the most I've done is hike on already busy hiking trails, and one thing I no longer do is wear headphones outside. Call it a nonsensical phobia, but I think it's more than that. Take this as a warning. If you ever find yourself in the woods listening to something in your headphones, be careful. You're never quite alone. And if you ever stumble upon a quickly abandoned campsite with an old pair of Sony headphones lying there, turn around and leave. Leave before you hear her crying. Wicked warning. From Lady Rain AK. Location, New Orleans. I was trucking down in the States with my ex. We had traveled coast to coast and had many weird experiences along the way. But this experience was rather freaky and possibly paranormal. It happened in New Orleans at the beginning of August 2005. We had finally made it to New Orleans, the home of voodoo and Mardi Gras. Ever since my brother told me about their graveyards, the voodoo shops, and the other strange but fun things down there, I had to go see it for myself. Call it morbid curiosity or just simply fascination with the macabre. Either way, I wanted to go. I heard the mausoleums and headstones are beautiful, and the local lore had me interested. Not to mention, I had just gotten a new 35mm camera, and I had taken a few photography classes in high school, so I wanted to capture the memories in the best way I knew how. I know 35mm was old school even back in 2005, but there was something about not knowing immediately how the shot would come out, not having instant gratification, that made me feel like I was some sort of real artist. We had dropped the trailer at the Home Depot we were unloading at, and drove down to Lafayette Cemetery. We zigged and zagged through the streets in complete awe of the old plantation-style homes. There was this one ginormous home in particular that looked like it could house at least half a football team. The place was utterly beautiful, but something about it made me feel uneasy. I'm sure a lot of horrible things happened down there, so we didn't stop, and we drove right on by. My ex did not, and I mean did not, like anything unknown, anything spiritual, or mildly occult-like, so he flat out refused to go with me, stating it was boring, but I could see that he was actually creeped out. Pulling into a nearly empty street, I had half expected there to be tons of people there, as what I had gathered this was supposed to be a tourist attraction. Since it was a residential area, we couldn't park the bobtail truck here. He tossed me my cell phone, which had like 15 minutes of prepaid call time left, and said to call him when I was done. He basically dropped me off at the gate and sped away like a complete chicken. The mausoleums looked like finely built homes, sitting there on stone pads, some of them growing moss and others had fresh flowers at their stoops. Walking the stone paths that weaved through the hollow ground, there was a complete ominous feeling, like I was being followed. It filled me with dread and excitement. The hairs on my neck stood up, and a chill ran through my body, causing my very existence to run cold. It was borderline 90 degrees outside, but I was shivering. I continued along the path, clicking away on my camera, taking pictures here and there of the weeping cherub angels and the praying figures that marked the headstones. I must have lost track of time, as the sun was beginning to dip down over a particularly unnerving set of trees. I had forgotten we were in the south, and the possibility of a snake or something just as freaky falling on that tree dawned on me, and I began to make my way back to the gate. The towering gate looked even more sinister in the dimming light. I quickened my pace and soon spotted a lady of African descent. She was probably nearing 80 years old and appeared very frail looking with a bright colored outfit, and her gray hair peeked out of a bandana-type headdress. Necklaces of what appeared to be wood or possibly bone were draped around her neck. I must have startled the poor woman, because she snapped her head towards my direction in such a swift movement. I was nearly startled myself. I was surprised she didn't break her neck. She was looking at me straight in the face now. I noticed then that she had one milky eye. The other was darting back and forth like it was searching for something to focus on. She had appeared so quickly, I was visibly shaken. She probably sensed my fear. I rationalized with myself that it was totally possible she was leaning down to put flowers on the nearby grave, but as I got closer to where she was, I didn't see any flowers. She motioned for me to come over, and despite my gut feeling, I walked cautiously over to where she stood. I assumed she simply needed help getting up or help to her car or something. I was trying to be the good citizen and get my good karma points for the day. I thought that I was far enough away that if for some reason I needed to bolt, I could, but I was apparently within arm's length of her now. She was swifter than a freaking lion when she grabbed me by the arm so tight that she left bruises on my forearm. Her nails dug into my skin, but I could barely let out more than a squeak of terror. She pulled me towards her leathery face and milky eye. Her good eye was almost solid black. The whites that were left had yellowed over time. Small serpents of red slithered across her face. She smelled of rotting leaves and iron. She smelled like decay. She spoke in a very deep, I've smoked 3 packs a day for 40 years deep, raspy voice, saying, "Get out." Excuse me? This is a public place, right? I'm just visiting, I don't mean any harm, I managed to say to her. Pulling me closer to her face, I could see her gnarly, snarled teeth. The few that were left were tobacco-stained and barely hanging on for dear life. Her hot breath was pungent. I swallowed back a gag. "Leave this place, or you will drown for your sins." I then hear off in the distance, "Hello? Are you there? Do you need me to come pick you up?" I had a ninja grip on my phone apparently, which I had subconsciously dug from my bag in a panic, while the old lady had me in her clutches. I didn't remember entering his number though, and we didn't have each other's numbers on speed dial, so the fact that my ex was on the other line was a blessing in disguise. Just as quickly as she snatched me, she let me go, almost forcibly throwing me to the ground. She was surprisingly strong for someone who appeared to be so frail. I walked to the outside gate, waiting on the curb for my ex to come around the corner. It was getting much darker, and the chirping of crickets started off in the distance. I could still see the lady pacing back and forth at the grave. She was watching me. Her mouth was still moving like she was talking to herself or perhaps cursing me. The chicken lights of the truck came into view, and I was finally safe. The hero of the story showed up on his white horse to save me. Or in this case, the Yahoo in a purple bobtail Peterbilt jerked to an abrupt stop as I nearly jumped into the street to get away from that cemetery. I flung the door open in one fell swoop, and I hopped into the front seat, slamming the door shut. Looking confused, my ex asked me if I was okay, why I looked so scared. Then a wry smile formed on his face as he began to poke fun at me, saying that I was the one getting scared, that I was afraid of the dark. He told me he knew it was a bad idea to visit the place of those that had passed. I told him what had happened with the old lady and exclaimed, "Heck yeah, I was scared. That old woman was freaky." He looked at me blankly and asked, "What lady?" Then he motioned toward the gate. The woman was gone, as if within the past few seconds she vanished. There were no other cars in the street, and it was empty besides the idling semi-truck we were in. There was only one way in and out, and we were parked right in front of it. If anyone would have come through the gate, we would have seen them. I stressed to my ex we needed to leave the state, telling him the old lady had warned me. But he didn't believe it, but went along with it as we headed out of the South. After that, we ended up stopping in Georgia and even in Northern California at one point, then along to Biloxi, Mississippi. And within those 2 weeks of almost constant driving, Hurricane Katrina hit. Maybe the old woman was right. Had I not listened to her in the Lafayette Cemetery, we may have very well been casualties to Hurricane Katrina. Terrorized Alone in the Woods. Submitted by Fig Wiggle. Here's my story of when I drove off the beaten path to end up being possibly the most scared I've ever been. At the time, I was 26 years old, and I loved traveling around Australia, camping in my van, usually by myself. And 99% of the time, these were all amazing experiences. On this particular trip, I was heading from Mount Kosciuszko in southern New South Wales, north towards the Blue Mountains, but I wanted to break up the drive for a night by camping in a state park and maybe take a shot or two at some rabbits with my longbow. I found what I thought to be the perfect isolated state park where hunting was allowed, and since it was midweek, the weather wasn't amazing. I figured I'd have the mountains mostly to myself. I'd not taken into account the quality of the back roads to access the camping site. They were very badly maintained rock and dirt tracks that my tiny Toyota van struggled with. It took me over an hour to travel the 30 kilometers to the campsite, swearing to myself often as I rattled over yet another patch of corrugated dirt with the rear end of my van spinning out behind me. I was feeling grim and tense when I finally pulled up into the site, but I relaxed pretty quickly as the site was empty of people, and I could see rabbits hopping around about 200 meters away in a meadow. As soon as I pulled up beside a designated fire pit, I strung my bow and headed after them. The little guys had obviously already been hunted a few times before though, as they were too skittish to get close enough for a confident shot. After some tries and fails, I let the rabbits go about their rabbit lives and headed back to the van, where I started a fire, poured a glass of whiskey, and lit a cigarette. Enjoying being out here in solitude and knowing that the closest population of people was over an hour's drive away. Now, I loved being by myself in the bush, but I've got this weird intuition thing that lets me know when I've landed in a safe space or not. A couple of times in the past, I've driven into a potential site, and after a while I get this pressure in my chest and stomach, and when that happens, I bail, no questions asked. After sitting around my fire for a while, I did begin to feel this pressure slightly, but after another whiskey, I decided to ignore it this time. It was far too late in the evening to tackle that road, and I was over the legal driving limit by now after that second whiskey. Truth be told, I was probably over the limit after my first glass, so I just sat there drinking, smoking, and watching the sun go down. The sun disappeared quickly as I was in the bowl of a small valley with looming mountains all around me, and after watching the first stars appear, I decided to call it a night. I dropped 2 pairs of shoes outside my van door. One was a small pair of sandals, and the other was my massive hiking boots. I always do this when camping alone, because I hope any creepers might think there's a man in the van, a big one, and leave me alone. I fell asleep pretty quickly. But the sound of a gunshot around midnight woke me straight up. It sounded like it was on the other side of the mountain range to my left, so I largely ignored it. Maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought I was, and that there were hunters out there after deer or wild pig. I fell back to sleep pretty quickly, but I didn't sleep as well as I did before. I was awakened again by a much louder gunshot, and it was about an hour later. This one had definitely been fired somewhere inside my little bowl in the bush, and it was a larger caliber rifle. The echo was huge in this confined valley. I was beginning to feel nervous. What if they were taking shots, and my van happened to be in the way if they missed their target? I peeked through my curtains and saw my fire still had a few glowing embers. I hoped that the hunters might see it and know not to shoot in my direction. That was my biggest concern at the time. I had no idea things were about to get much, much worse. For the next hour or so, I drifted in and out of sleep, snapping awake and aware of even the smallest noise. On one of these bouts of drifting in and out of consciousness, I heard a sound that had me sit straight up in bed. I hit my head on the roof of the van pretty hard by accident, but I did not even notice at that point, as I was concentrating so hard on the noise that had awoke me. Tires rolling and grinding on the rocky dirt track leading to my campsite. Now, I'm sure there could have been a few reasonable explanations for a car taking this isolated dead-end road at 3 in the morning. I even tried to think of a few, but I failed because I was so nervous, and I just sat there in my bed, straining my ears to the utmost, trying to figure out what this car was doing. Suddenly, my van was filled with a shockingly bright light as the mystery car turned into the campsite and stared down my van. I waited for the headlights to swing away, but they didn't. I couldn't see the car. My van has curtains at every window, and like crazy, I was parting them to give whoever was out there a good look into the van and at me. I was already feeling pretty spooked, but my terror rose sky high as I realized the car was now slowly driving towards me. The lights got brighter, the rumble of the diesel engine got louder, and what sounded like the world's heaviest and biggest tires rumbled and popped at the rocks underneath them. By then, I was frozen in place, too terrified to move even a muscle, as the four-wheeled beast kept slowly moving forward until it was nose to nose with my tiny van. The headlights were so blinding, even through my curtains, that I had to turn back to face the other way, with my back towards the front of my van. Then I almost wet myself. Whoever was driving that car started revving the engine over and over, harder and longer each time. It was the most aggressive sound I'd ever heard coming from a machine, and I honestly can't tell you how freaking scared I was. I didn't know it was possible to feel more terror than I was already feeling, but I found out quickly it is always possible to reach higher levels of fear, because that was when the doors opened. They had exited their car and they were coming closer. I broke the trance of fear long enough to grab my 6-inch hunting knife from the shelf above my head. I gripped it with white knuckles as I listened to a pair of heavy footsteps start to walk slowly towards my van. The other person must have been standing just outside their car watching and waiting, as I didn't hear the second pair of footsteps. Maybe they were more stealthy and quiet, who knows? All I know is that I was straining my ears, and I was focused solely on the slow, purposeful steps of the first stranger as they stopped beside the sliding door of my van, right where I had dumped my 2 pairs of shoes. My van was locked at every entry point, but 100 what-if scenarios were running at light speed through my head. Maybe I could dive into the driver's seat of the van and belt out of there. Fat chance, with them being parked right in front of me. Even if I did manage to drive around them, I still had 30 kilometers of rough bush road to navigate. Bush tracks that their far superior car could manage with ease. I'd be run down before I'd even gone 100 meters. I could string my bow and jump out to confront them, but then I'd never been that keen on suicide. So I thought I'd give that one a miss. I didn't even have a map of the area, so running like a scared rabbit into the bush wasn't even an option. Oh, the irony. So what I did was wait, frozen in my sitting position, still white-knuckling my knife, while person 1 finally moved away from the side door of my van back to the car. Their engine revved again and again, as if trying to scare me out, and I still sat there. I sat still for what felt like hours, but was most likely just a few minutes, as I vaguely heard voices under the rumble of the engine. I couldn't make out a word, but the voices sounded masculine, and eventually, they just got in their car and slowly rolled away. I know how anticlimactic that sounds, but honestly, I don't really care a whole bunch. At the time, I was filled with so much relief, I was almost high off of it. And at the same time, I was so exhausted from the adrenaline, I felt I could sleep a week straight. I didn't sleep, though. Thoughts of them just hiding around the corner of the road waiting for me to make a break for it were running through my head, as irrational as that may have sounded. I think the most confusing thing was having absolutely no idea what they wanted. They could have just been hunters, I heard, who maybe saw my fire and thought they'd come down to say hi, do a bit of lighthearted terrorizing. Or they could have had much darker things on their mind. Maybe they were locals who wanted to play a prank to relieve their small-town boredom. Anyone wants to shed some light on it, go for it. After 20 minutes of silence, I finally managed to pry my fingers off the handle of my knife, one by one, using my left hand to do it. I put my knife beside me on the bed and sat staring glassy-eyed at the curtain on my rear window, with my knees pulled to my chest until faint light filtered through the material, turning my interior from black to smoky morning gray. I peeked out at the pre-dawn day and saw no car, no other people, just more rabbits who I now could not find the heart or motivation to hunt. I opened the sliding door and struggled outside, feeling like I was in a dream. I made a cup of the strongest coffee in the world and sipped it while staring distractedly at the footprints surrounding my van. Then I got into the driver's seat and drove an hour back to the main road. I kept expecting to see the car around each hidden bend, but really, I would have no idea if I saw it or not. I never saw anything of the vehicle or men who terrorized me, so that was that. I drove up to the Blue Mountains and met up with some Belgian friends, and ended up sticking with them for the rest of the 6-week trip. But I never forgot the feeling of being that scared, that helpless, That alone. Rarely, if ever, do I choose to camp in an empty campsite now. Now I'd rather move on to another one, filled with people. I have a few more stories of scares in the woods, and if you like this one, I'll be sure to write it down. Thank you for listening. I Survived the Dogman by Unnamed Hunter. The incident occurred in November of 2015, the week before Youth Weekend in Vermont. I went out alone with my hatchet, machete, and water. That's it. I thought myself a self-made survivalist, and I was either too young or too dumb to know any better. I didn't know how truly dangerous the wilderness could be. To set the scene for you, I was alone in 110 acres of woods. I stupidly chose to go to the thickest section. I walked out to an area of spruce trees that had a decent amount of deer activity, and once I got to the location, I got to work making my deer blind using deadfalls and spruce boughs. I was making a lot of noise with my hatchet, cutting logs to make the 3 walls to lean the spruce boughs on. That's when I thought I heard a stick snap behind me. I stopped and slowly turned to see what had made the sound. When I turned around, I saw that I was still alone, although I did notice that the woods around me had gone unnaturally quiet. I was too inexperienced to know that that was a bad sign. I went back to work, and the same snaps kept happening, moving around the side of me. That's when I heard a guttural growl, a snarl. I turned and saw huge dog-like legs with claws or nails that were at least 3 inches long. I looked up, trembling as I took in the sight. Not even 15 feet away from me was the largest dog or wolf-looking thing I'd ever seen, and what really disturbed me was the way it had a human expression upon its face, baring its teeth in a chilling-looking smile. I was dumbfounded. All I could think to do was keep my eyes on it and slowly back away. I did exactly that, and it did the same, mirroring my movement, but coming closer, not backing up like I was. It only stopped when I made it to the edge of the woods. I do not know why it didn't follow me out, why it didn't end me when it had the chance, because it easily could have at any moment. These days, I don't do my hunting or surviving out in those woods anymore, and if you go out in the woods yourself, I don't recommend you go unless you go well armed. Sublette, Idaho Hunting Trip by Idaho Livin'. A few years back, I was invited by my friend Matt to go deer hunting in a range of mountains neither of us had ever been to before. Matt had gone up a few days ahead of me to claim a nice camping spot and to hunt with his son for a few days on their own. The day I headed up, I had found their camping spot, but no one was there, and I concluded that they went hunting early that day, as it was just after sunup. So I decided to go explore and hunt on my own, and I came back around midday thinking they would be back by then. So I unloaded my ATV, donned my hand-sewn ghillie suit, something I had made just the week before. Then I set out. After a while of driving around and taking short hikes into areas that seemed like sure things that would have been chocked full with deer, but I got skunked every time. What we call it when we don't see anything when hunting. I stumbled into an area that had been burned up in a forest fire earlier this year. I'd never been in a burned up area like this before, and I was just absorbing all the visual shock of the devastation. I was walking along the ridgeline of the burned area, looking as far as I could see across all the other ridges where the fire had burnt it up. I even found the burned, charred remains of some poor little critter, too unfortunate to escape in the blaze. Shaking my head to clear my mood and focus on why I came here, I tried to gauge distances with no points of reference. But I spotted a clear patch of dirt down at the bottom of the ravine. It must have been 250 yards, give or take. I set the riser sight on my rifle to the 250 mark and took a shot at a rock roughly the size of a small dog in the middle of the patch of bare dirt, and I nailed it. Satisfied with the shot, and seeing that it was midday now, I headed back to camp. As I was nearing the camp, I saw a skinned and cleaned out deer hanging from a tree, and I met up with my friend. We chatted for a while about his son bagging the deer, about the burned up area and the moose he saw. Moose are unusual to us as the mountains we grew up around have a very small population of them, and you rarely ever saw them. Anyway, we cooked up some lunch and sat down by a campfire. My friend said he was going to run down the mountain to get a cell signal and call his wife to pick up his son. We put the fire out and they took off. I decided around that time to go hunting again, but headed in the opposite direction this time, away from the burned up area. I found a nice trail for ATVs and drove up it. It was a beautiful drive through an aspen grove. It was mid-fall and the leaves were all golden in color. The mid-afternoon sun almost seemed to sparkle off of them. The cool, crisp autumn air was filled with a perfumed aroma of the aspens. I came to the end of the trail only because a huge tree had fallen down across the path some years ago, and it had never been cleared out. I got off of my ATV and walked up the abandoned and overgrown trail. After a bit of a hike, I was in pine trees with low-hanging branches just at my head level, and I had to do a lot of ducking to get around. After a while, I noticed that all the low pine branches were all broken and roughed up, as if deer or elk had been tearing them up. Feeling like I was in a lucky zone, I kept going up the trail. I finally ran into an area that had no grass in the ground and could tell what kind of animal was on the trail. Sure enough, I seemed to have found the deer and elk highway. I was beyond stoked now. Further up the trail, I found some leg bones of a deer. And I have a habit of trying to find the whole skeleton in hopes of finding the skull, because if it still had antlers attached, those were very useful or could be used as tools or trophies. Searching around for a few minutes, I found the entire skeleton, but it was female. But I spotted another leg bone nearby, an elk bone, and I went to look for that skeleton as well. I found it a few moments later, only to see it was a small young female. I started to get a funny feeling like I should get out of the area, and I started to back out. I was looking around when I noticed carnivore scat and bones of even smaller animals. The whole way back, I was looking over my shoulder until I reached my ATV. I sped back to camp and started the fire again, and I sat there drinking until my friend Matt finally showed back up. We stayed in camp until his wife showed up to pick up their son and to take him home. Matt and I discussed our hunting plans for the next day. As we were sitting there, we saw a large black animal walking on the hill across from our camp. At first, we assumed it was a rancher's cow, but took a second look through binoculars when we realized it was alone, and cows tend to stay with the herd. Matt muttered, just another moose, looking through his binoculars. As for the hunting plans we came up with, Matt would be going to hunt where his son had bagged that deer, and I was going to hunt at a creek near our camp where Matt said he saw plenty of deer. I opted not to go with Matt, as I didn't want to take a long drive to where they were hunting on the back side of the mountain, near some farmers' fields, and I preferred to hunt nearby. The next day, we woke up at around 4:30 a.m. I boiled a kettle of water to make some instant oatmeal, a true hunter's breakfast. Matt asked me one more time if I was sure I didn't want to go with him to his spot. I firmly said no. I had a good feeling about hunting over at the creek. He gave me one last warning about watching out for moose, then took off. I put on my ghillie suit and my headlamp and walked over to the creek. It wasn't far from our camp, a few hundred yards at best. I couldn't see anything through the darkness, and my headlamp only seemed to light up the area 4 feet ahead of me, and anything beyond that was too dim and hard to make out. The batteries weren't fresh, so that didn't help. I managed to find a spot I thought was going to be good. I sat there, and I waited for daylight. The sky was beginning to brighten, and I could make out more of the landscape. Dim but clearer than my headlamp could make it. A little while after that, I could see well enough to make out an even better spot to wait out an animal and a clump of aspens with a clear line down the whole creek. I walked over as quietly as I could, and I got set up there. As the morning light was getting bright enough to see totally clearly, I could hear all sorts of things moving around in the thick brush beyond the tree line of the creek. I sat and planned out scenarios through my head of what I would do if I saw a deer in certain areas. Then, out of the bushes on my right side, within 2 feet of me, trotted out 3 coyotes in single file. I nearly jumped, but remained calm. I mean, I could have reached out and grabbed one by the tail. They were that close. I was amazed at the effectiveness of my ghillie suit and the scent spray. They had no idea I was there. A few moments later, I heard something else getting closer to the creek through the dense brush. I could tell the direction it was heading. It moved quietly out of my hiding spot and heard it was just on the other side of a large pine tree. Of course, by then the coyotes were long gone. I was using my scope this time, and I set the zoom to the lowest power and began to kneel down. I had one eye through the scope, and the other eye looking at the tree waiting for the animal to pop out. My heart was pounding in anticipation. Whatever it was, it sounded huge. I even had a second thought about the situation. Was I really ready for whatever was on the other side? I realized all too late that I'd never hunted something so large, and if it was a deer, it would definitely not be walking around, not caring what knew it was there. It was not even trying to be quiet. That moment, the head of this huge animal came out from behind the tree. At first, it was looking down at the ground. It noticed me and looked over my way. It was the biggest moose I'd ever seen. I could have used one of the moose's paddles as a hammock for myself. That big. The magazine photos I've seen and other trophy mounts I've witnessed, this animal was by far larger than any of those and was standing a mere 10 yards away from me. It was that moment you realize you're in trouble and time seems to stand still and let you think of an option. By then, I was too far away from the tree line to be able to run back into the thick aspens where I had been without that thing reaching me. My hope was that my ghillie suit would confuse the moose, and I hoped that getting close to the willow shrub could save me from getting stepped on. So I tried to situate myself as close to the willow shrub as possible without giving away my position. If this thing stepped on me, I'd be done for. I couldn't see anything going on around me. The hood of my suit was large and was covering my whole head. I could hear the moose snorting and grunting angrily. And then I heard the sounds of at least 5 more individuals, large animals moving out of the thick brush and heading to the creek. I was in deep, too deep. I was so scared I was shaking, and it's hard to manage to stay still in that kind of situation. I had the thought of shooting my rifle off and trying to scare all the moose away and take the risk of being stepped on by a 2,000-pound animal. As I went to slowly move my hand up to the trigger, my wrist was caught on my sling and I could not move my arm up to the trigger all the way. As the old military saying goes, there is no such thing as an atheist in a foxhole during a firefight. I found myself praying for a way out. After what I think was 5 minutes, I hear the herd head back into the brush. I waited even longer for silence again. I peeked out as best I could under my hood to my sides, and I didn't see anything. I slowly pushed myself up, pulled my hood back, and looked around. That's when I heard a snort. I looked behind me to see the massive male only 5 feet from me, and it knew I was there. It was angry. I went back down and put my hood back up real quick, but the moose continued to snort and grunt. I heard it begin to thrash the willow bush with its paddles. I was shaking uncontrollably at the moment. I started praying for someone to drive by and scare the attacking thing away. I didn't know if anyone would drive by, because the whole day I had only seen 2 other people. The moose finally stopped thrashing on the willow bush and was now just snorting. I forced myself to calm down, but I couldn't stop thinking that one good strike with its paddles or a hoof, and I wouldn't be alive anymore. It could happen at any moment. No matter how hard I tried, I was still shaking a bit from the adrenaline, but I had calmed down mostly. What seemed like hours passed, waiting for this moose to move on. Finally, a large truck drove by. I heard them stop and comment on the massive size of the moose, and they didn't even see that I was there. A few moments later, the moose just trots off into the brush after it's heard. The truck drove off, and I got up and got out of there as fast as I could. I jumped the creek and jogged up to the road. I went and sat next to some small bushes and went over what the heck just happened. As I was sitting there, some deer happened to pop out and get a drink. I raised my rifle, but for the first time in my hunting career, I hesitated. A thought raced through my head. How could I even think about taking this animal's life moments after something bigger than me only narrowly and unknowingly spared mine? I lowered my rifle and muttered to myself, "Not today, buddy." I walked back to camp and waited for Matt. After a couple of hours, he showed back up to camp, and I told him my story of what had happened. I'm sure he thought it was a BS story and said to me, "I told you, dude, there was moose," and he laughed at me. To this day, I still wonder if those people in the truck took a picture of that moose, and perhaps they unknowingly captured a photo of a man with the look of death in his eyes. Truck stop horror. Another experience from Lady Rain, AK. Location: roads across America. I lived in a small town, and I never really traveled outside of my home state. I never experienced life in a way that others would. We were kind of sheltered from the big crime and other things that had been happening over the countryside. So my now ex decided to take me on a journey of being an over-the-road truck driver. In a lot of cases, this was a great experience. There were a lot of fun times, and I got to see most of the United States. But trucking life is hard, and being on the road 24/7 is not easy. Being cooped up in a small truck with someone for that long will cause anyone to become mad, as in bat crap crazy. Life on the road is much different now than it was when I was trucking. People now have better tech and the ability to binge watch your favorite YouTube channel, surf the web, or play games on your phone to keep yourself occupied. The only forms of entertainment we had back then was either watching one of the dozen or so DVDs, reading yet another book, or talking on the radio. We often opted for talking on the radio, which became our version of social media. We even had different identities or personas to hide behind while interacting with the different people who were basically strangers to us, and I think we all know how creepy certain truckers can be. We kept a bit of anonymity on our side to stay safe on the road. When you're a trucker, you acquire a CB handle. My ex's was Ninja Dwarf, and mine was Northern Exposure, as I was from Alaska. During the time on the road, you meet a lot of crazy people, and you see a ton of crazy stuff, and I do mean a ton. People often hear about stories of things that happen on the road. Most of them are more gross than scary. You know, like drivers getting a little too friendly with their cabin buddy, whether it's a dog, a cat, or even a goat. Because yeah, crazy stuff happens on the road. And I saw it by accident firsthand a few times. But those are stories for a different time. This time, was one of the most terrifying experiences of my entire life. When it comes to strange and unusual events, this world is full of them, and I got lucky enough to be a part of it. Have you ever gotten the heebie-jeebies from someone's voice? Like flat out scared to talk to someone? A voice that makes you think that the person on the other line is not at all there, you know. That was this guy. Something about him just made my skin crawl, and I had only ever heard his voice through the crackle of the CB radio. The CB started to crackle and we heard the distant call. You could barely hear a voice through the static, but eventually he got close enough we could hear him clearly. He must have been 50 miles or so behind us, because it was still faint, but our CB radio was peaked and tweaked, meaning it could really reach out and touch someone, kind of like when everyone's got 3G and you're running 5G. We could just barely hear him through the chatter of the CB. And then I finally really heard his voice. It's hard to explain, but the best way I could now describe it would be like how Heath Ledger talks as the Joker in the Batman movie. Like a slurred voice through gritted teeth that had been smiling for hours. There was something just off about it, and it gave me chills. He said to us, "Hey there, Purple Pete," which was the color of our truck. "Where you headed?" My ex hollered back that we were heading to Arkansas. The driver said he was going the same way and asked if he could tag along, and introduced himself as Maniac. We would run from one coast to another, then back again. This guy always seemed to be running the same route as us, but we had never physically seen his truck, though he described it as a 378 long-nosed Peterbilt that was black and had a brow and a cattle guard. According to him, he ran dry box from California to Florida, which explained why he always seemed to be either coming or going on the I-10. One week, when we were running from Florida back to LA, we actually caught up to him on his back trip from Redmond, Washington to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He told us he would meet up with us in Nevada when we did our trip back, because by then we would have run out of hours and needed to take a rest. We said sure to him, even though I really did not want to meet this guy. But my ex seemed to really like him, so we gave him an ETA on when we'd be back in that area and what truck stop we would be at. We were going to meet up with him for a meal. This was really before the idea of having a cell phone for anything other than emergencies, so it wasn't like we could just call him when we were going to be in the area. He agreed and we parted ways. My ex continued to talk to him until the radios would no longer reach. We had finished our load that day and were heading back to Las Vegas to the truck stop, the one we had agreed upon, and waited. Las Vegas is a shady place for truckers in general. There's often quite a bit of crime there. I've seen my fair share of cops live while in truck stops, and I mean right in front of my face. Watching them do sting operations is pretty entertaining to say the least. We waited in the truck for what seemed like forever, until we got bored and ventured into the truck stop for a bit. We waited and waited, until eventually we passed enough time where we could take another load, so we had to head out. We never actually met up with the guy in Nevada. But a few months later, we ran into him in Oklahoma. We had heard some chatter on the radio about these lot lizards, truck stop girls you could pay for, if you catch my drift, whose lives had been brutally stolen at truck stops in Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Tennessee. Folks on the radio chalked it up to drama, but at the time, none of us had anything better to do than make up truck driver stories. We kept hearing about it though, and even brought it up to Maniac the next time we heard from him. I remember he laughed about it.
Must be one real sicko doing it. Must just be a story, because if it was true, they would have caught him already. I'm sure there's tons of fingerprints and fluids at the crime scene. With as messy as the crime scenes were, I'm sure he wants to be caught.
That seemed like a really weird thing to say, but he was a very weird guy, so that was totally in character for Maniac. Maniac went his way and we went ours, and after a while I forgot about the weird comment. Fast forward a few weeks later, we were in Mississippi and we hear a familiar voice on the radio, and it was Maniac. We had taken a long weekend because it was Labor Day, and most companies were okay with drivers taking an extra day off then. Our plan was to make it to this lake out in the middle of nowhere. We were going to drop our trailer off and head out bobtail. So we chatted with Maniac, and he said he was going to Tennessee and that he would be heading out the next morning. And so, cutting our much-needed break short and bypassing the weekend at the lake, my ex decided to run with him so that there was someone to talk to. We had gotten into an argument earlier and I wasn't talking to him, and he absolutely hated the silent treatment. They chatted and I tried to ignore the conversations, but I couldn't help but overhear that the topic changed to the truck stop lot lizards. My ex tried to be a hard A, and he straight up told Maniac that he wasn't scared of the guy, and that he could defend himself from a sicko like him. But then I remember hearing him say,
"It's not you he's after."
He said it with this raspy chuckle, and then they quickly changed the subject. Our load was to be delivered in North Carolina in a few days, so being a few hours ahead of the deadline just meant we would be at the top of the line to pick up our load. It was a win-win. We left the following morning. The guys decided we would stop in Tennessee and finally meet each other. All this after 6 months of chatting. By then we weren't so afraid to meet up with the guy. Except for me. I was still very on edge about it. I was no slouch, and I grew up with 15 boys in the house. It was a big household, and I was quite the fighter because I had to be. My ex was a larger dude too, standing 6'3" and about 280 pounds. So in theory, we were ready for anything. The only way someone could get the best of us is if they were prepared or armed, which back then was highly illegal to have in the trucks, and if you were caught by the Department of Transportation, it would be jail time, no questions asked. With our company, we had very specific fuel stations we could use to top off at, but Maniac was an owner-operator, so he could go anywhere. Maniac said he'd already stopped to get fuel and took a shower, but he would drop his trailer off and meet us at a Flying J patrol station that was down the road from where he was, which I believe was a Love's fuel station. So we get ready to fuel up and we showered. Then we got a booth at the restaurant. We waited about 45 minutes before ordering food. Once more, we waited and waited. No one ever showed up, and there was no way to contact him besides getting close enough to him over the CB radio, which at this point was going to be random. My ex was not a patient man, so we ate and headed back out to the truck. You could tell, too, that he was obviously irritated with being stood up for a second time by the same guy that claimed to be his friend. I remember it being a dark and humid night. It was probably 10 p.m. There wasn't much for noise in the truck stop, which was unnerving. A quiet truck stop is a creepy truck stop. We walked across the fuel island to be greeted to a crap ton of flashing lights. Several cops, state troopers, a coroner's van, a fire truck, and 2 ambulances. All of which, if they had lights, they were flashing. It was quite the spectacle, and completely unexpected. It's not uncommon for either lizards to get busted or drivers to get involved in crap they are not supposed to, so we didn't think much of it. Cops and a truck stop go hand in hand after all, but this was more than just your typical truck stop shenanigans. Something major was going down, and the truck stop was now suddenly abuzz. We passed 12 trucks or so. This was one of the bigger Flying J's, so it could probably fit about 80 trucks and trailers in the lot if you went all the way back to the dirt. And then you could probably Tetris a dozen or so trucks in the dirt lot, which happened to be where our truck was. Now, I'm a curvy girl, and I wouldn't call myself fat, but I definitely don't look like I belong in a truck stop. I was used to drivers looking at me all creepy like. I always got taunted and harassed for being a lot lizard even though I was a driver. In fact, there are some truck stops that are not safe for me to walk in alone. I was walking with my ex, and we weren't holding hands or anything, but it was obvious that I was with him. We walked down a row and saw a bobtail truck parked in a full parking spot. I thought it was weird, as he had no trailer, but he was in a spot for one. Typically, bobtail trucks will park at the end of a run and leave the big spaces for trucks with trailers, because that was again another unspoken truck driver rule. We moved by the bobtail truck. It was a dark truck, maybe a dark black or blue with a cattle guard and a brow. I don't remember seeing what type of truck it was. Old school trucker code was if you were looking for company, the driver would park and leave his reading red light on to tell lot lizards that the driver was looking for entertainment. The guy was sitting in the passenger seat, and he had the red reading light on, so I could see his face. It was a bit distorted, but he gave me the creepiest smile, and then quickly shut his blinds. We were about 6 trucks down from the bobtail. I could see his truck from ours, and I remember looking back and seeing the red light still illuminating through the porthole window in the passenger door. There was a small slit down the curtain showing a dark spot, and I could see eyes. The guy in the truck was still watching us. Even with as warm as it was, chills flew up my spine, and I felt uneasy. My gut wrenched with a sudden feeling of dread. I honestly thought I was going to get sick. We finally got back to the truck and turned on the CB for our night of entertainment, and to see if we could radio Maniac, to see what the deal was in the lot. The chatter was about all the cops and the ambulance, fire truck, and DOT. All the commotion seemed to be across from us, but 2 rows up. People were saying that they found a body, a lot lizard, and that it was bad, like gnarly and brutal. One driver started trying to explain it, but he was then told that he had to keep his mouth shut by a police officer. Being nosy, though, my ex and I jumped out of the truck to go investigate. We dodged in and out of the trucks and managed to wiggle our way up to the scene. You know when you hear the phrase, "some things can't be unseen"? This was one of them. The lady, what was left of her, had been tied to the trailer in the truck. Then someone pulled the kingpin, that piece that locks the two together, and let down the landing gear. The driver, who was now sitting in the back of a police car, handcuffed, his head hung limp with his forehead on the back of the seat, was crying big heavy sobs, and there was vomit on his shirt. We could hear them through the closed door. He was screaming that he had nothing to do with it, and praying to God to be forgiven for what he had done. That poor driver had obviously not done his safety check before he left, and just decided to pull out of his space while she was attached. Without getting too graphic, I can tell you that a normal human body should never look like that. It was like something you would see from a Saw film. I remember stumbling back and bumping into another driver. He just looked at me, pale, and looked as if he was going to get sick. I don't do well with that body function, so I moved quickly away from him and started making my way back to the truck. I was basically running back, without even thinking about having my ex with me. I made it to the truck and tugged on the door, but it wouldn't open. So I ran to the truck stop full speed. I was going to be sick, and I'd rather not have people see me or watch me. I passed the spot where the bobtail truck was parked, and I noticed it was gone. My ex made it into the truck stop looking for me. He said he would walk me back to the truck, so I could get some rest and forget about this awful night. Yeah, right. Like I could sleep after that. He turned on the radio and began to talk to the other drivers. No one else had seen much. There hadn't even been much lizard traffic. The police had been working overtime that night, cleaning up the truck stops after they had caught wind of the first few crime scenes. I sat in the bunk and just kind of stared out of the windshield at the flashing lights. There was a tap on the door all of a sudden, and it nearly made me jump through the roof. A police officer said he was getting statements from everyone at the truck stop. He gave us the rundown about safety in numbers and to not go anywhere alone. I wasn't even planning on leaving this truck. I told him about the creepy guy that smiled at us in the bobtail truck, and I gave him a description of the truck. But the officer didn't see the point of me telling him about a creepy guy, but he took down the information anyway. I don't think I slept for days after that. I just kept seeing the image of that woman. Flashes kept going through my head. The vivid image of her face, the red rag that was in her mouth, and the 100-mile-per-hour tape around her wrists, tying her to the headache rack. She had obviously struggled because there were bruises formed on her stomach and her face. Mascara was running down her cheeks, and that smell of iron. I can barely recount this story to you without being queasy. It didn't seem to faze my ex much. He went on like it wasn't anything big or special. After a few weeks, I finally managed to get the image out of my head, or I had finally convinced myself that it wasn't real. It was just a scene from a scary movie. Yeah, that's what it was. Either way, I was glad for the time being having it out of my head. Fast forward to February, about 3 months after that incident, and we were heading to New Orleans. I was super excited to see the area, and hopefully get in to see the Mardi Gras. I wanted to visit the cemeteries to see the mausoleums and go into the voodoo shops and such. We had an extra few hours to spend there, so I was happy when my ex said we could go wandering around for a bit. We parked at this little truck stop. It was one that didn't show up on the big Rand McNally maps. We were told about it by another driver. It really wasn't more than a hole in the wall, a ma-and-pa shop with a small dirt lot and a flickering light pole on one end, but it was within walking distance of the French Quarter, which was where I wanted to go.
Hey there, Purple Pete. What brings you out all this way?
The voice on the CB radio was loud, so he was really close. There were only 2 other trucks in the lot, an old Freightliner hauling a Swift trailer and a dark green Kenworth that had a cattle car in the back hauling cows. My ex was still a bit miffed about being stood up months ago. He could really hold a grudge when he wanted to. "Maniac, man, where the heck have you been? Why'd you stand us up back there, buddy?" My ex radioed back.
Man, you know how it is. Cops make me a bit uneasy, and I'd rather not get caught.
Caught? What do you mean, man? My ex questioned.
Don't worry about it. You just keep an eye on that girl of yours. I'd really hate for something bad to happen to her. Like all of those other girls.
We watched the CB key up, again burying the needle on the radio. The signal was so high, it had to be in the same freaking truck stop. Maniac was keyed up, but just kind of breathing into the mic.
You know, I really like to play with them before I destroy them. Nasty. They're so nasty, so dirty, so defiled. You know they had it coming.
It sounded like he was talking through gritted teeth. His voice was louder than before. We could hear the rumble of a truck heading down the one-way street that ended in the truck stop. We looked at each other. This was the only time I'd ever seen anything like fear in my ex's eyes. Tears began to well up in mine, and for the first time I was truly scared. A dust cloud came rolling up into the truck stop, and this dark, black, menacing Peterbilt with a cattle guard and a brow came rolling by slowly. The driver keyed up just as he went past the nose of our truck. It was that same creepy guy, creepy eyes, creepy smile from the truck stop months ago. He twisted that freaking grin at me as he put the mic up to his lips.
Be safe out there, you two. I'd hate to run into you again.
His CB handle was pinstriped on his driver door, saying Maniac in bright red letters. We reported this to the police, though there wasn't a very big search going on for him. Guess there wasn't enough concrete evidence beyond what he said to us. In April of 2004, we headed back to Alaska because my ex's father had a massive heart attack. We stayed there for a while, before heading back onto the road. As far as I know, there were 7 total scenes or incidents. There could have been more. Who knows how long he had actually been doing this? I don't know if the guy was ever caught, and I found evidence online about the other incidents, but never any answer on if he was still out there. I can tell you one thing though. The second time around, I wasn't making friends with anyone on the road, and I always kept a 6-inch blade on me at all times, just in case I ever saw a maniac again. Werewolf in the Barn by Skylar H. I lived in South Minnesota on a private property in farm country. The property was rather large and heavily wooded in most parts. There was also a small pond and steep stream bed. It was the beginning of November when I had my encounter with this monster. My wife and I had just finished cleaning up after our yearly Halloween party. We had invited the entire family out and set up a haunted trail that the younger people in the family could enjoy. It was 2 days after the party had happened. It was about 8:50 p.m. We had finally finished storing all the decorations, and we also moved our 5 horses up to the main barn from their lockout pasture. We had put them down there so we could use the main pasture for the trail. The horses did not make it very easy though. They bolted as soon as we opened their gate. This wasn't usually like them. We basically had to run the mile uphill to catch up. We set out fresh hay and locked them in, since there was going to be a hard freeze that night. I had just put dinner in and was enjoying some television when my phone got a text message in the kitchen. I lazily got to my feet when I heard the horses going crazy in the barn. I figured one of the farm dogs had gotten locked in with them. They do prefer to sleep on the hay instead of our carpet. I grabbed my spotlight and I walked out to the porch. Surprisingly, I found all my dogs there, all of them staring at the barn. I shined the light down into the lockout pasture and saw the horses all on one side of the corral. They were also staring at the open barn door. At that point, I was still assuming they had gotten spooked by something small, maybe a bat flying around or a tool falling off the wall. I yelled back to my wife, who was upstairs. "Something spooked the horses. I'm gonna go round them up. Can you help out?" It took her a minute to reply, saying that she'd be out in a few. I called for the dogs to come with me and started for the barn. I walked into the barn pasture, and the horses immediately trotted to crowd around me, almost pushing me over. I yelled and they backed off, giving me some space. My wife's mare, Cherry, kept rubbing her muzzle against me, eyes wide and terrified. I grabbed a nearby stool and brush and began to pat her backside, which is something she enjoyed, and I was trying to calm her down real quick. And that's when I noticed the 4 long parallel slashes going down her leg. I immediately thought there was a bear, and I shone the light into the barn. Besides a few tools and some buckets thrown around, there was nothing. I figured if there was a bear, it had smelled some of the garbage left in the upper level from the party. I was about to start to lock the horses back up when I noticed a bale of hay lying on the floor, twine still on it. It was not there when I locked them up. I went rigid and shone my light up to the loft, expecting to see a black bear, but I could only see the first couple of feet of the loft, so I had to climb up. I walked over to the ladder and noticed some dark gray hair hanging on a nail about halfway up. Right before I was about to climb up, I heard my wife behind me start to scream, along with the horses whinnying. I spun around to see her shining her own light upward to the top of the barn. "The window," she said. Drawing my courage, I climbed up the ladder, and I looked toward the window. It wasn't a bear. At first, I thought it was one of my younger relatives pulling a prank on me. But when the creature opened its mouth and started to pant like a dog, I knew it was no prank. It was about 6 feet tall and at least 200 pounds, halfway through the window of the barn loft. It was dark gray with a lighter shade around its neck. Its head was very similar to a German Shepherd, but with a much larger muzzle. And its eyes, the closest I can describe them in color, would be beer, but like someone was showing a dull yellow light through it. Those eyes were locked on me, mouth still open, revealing sharp and jagged teeth, stained light brown. It was almost leaning out of the window, one hand resting on the side. Its hands resembled almost a raccoon's hands, with long bony fingers and sharp claws. I slowly climbed back out of the barn, and I made my way to my wife. There we could still see this thing, now on the other side of the window, staring out. My wife was about to scream again, but I shot my hand back and covered her mouth. She immediately grabbed my arm and clung to me. The creature put both hands on the window, while I leaned down and whispered to my wife, "On 3, we run and we don't look back." Before I could finish the sentence, the creature had jumped down and went to all fours, growling, and we simply bolted. We ran the 25-yard gap between the house and barn in record time. The dogs had all run back to the deck and were now growling and baring their teeth at the thing. My wife reached the door first and flung it open, but when she turned to me, she screamed. I risked it, glancing back behind me, and saw that the thing was terribly close, less than 10 feet. I reached the front steps and jumped as hard and as far as I could, and thankfully landed inside with the dogs right behind me. My wife slammed the door and was then thrown back as the door was flung back open, the thing standing up and staring down at us, baring its teeth. It wasn't all the way in, though. I jumped up and placed all my weight into the barely opened door. It shut and latched, but I soon felt something heavy outside slamming its weight against the door, and I heard the wood begin to crack. My wife thankfully had recovered and rushed to my side to set the lock in place. We then left the entryway, locking every door we saw, and ran into our kitchen. The only window there was a small one above the sink, which we hid under, hopefully out of sight of the thing. We huddled there for 3 hours, waiting and listening. Each of our dogs were set in different entryways in other rooms, all observant and waiting as well. We heard each one growling, one after the other, as if something was outside the house, walking around. Not too long after that, we heard the horses whining, followed by a loud crash. I figured they had broke down the gate and had escaped back into the pasture. We felt relieved until one of the dogs bared its teeth a moment later, and the assault on our house continued. Eventually, around midnight, when things settled down, the dogs no longer bared their teeth. We went to the bedroom, shut all the curtains, and locked the doors. We tried to sleep, but every little sound outside made me jump, and my wife was worried about our horses. Just when the sun began to rise, we managed to fall asleep. When we woke up, we immediately got dressed and went to check on the horses. They were all fine, scared but fine. We patched up Cherry, my wife's mare, with her deep gashed cuts. We went over to the barn door to see what needed fixing, but what we saw surprised us. The latch to the barn door had been undone and flipped up, the way a person would open it. No animal could do that. I realized this thing must have been quite intelligent, which made it all the more horrifying. That day we went into town. We got a deadbolt for the barn, and we went to a sporting goods store and bought a gun. After that night, we didn't have any more encounters, unless you count the horses refusing to leave the barn a few weeks later. I asked my nearby neighbors if anything strange had happened on their properties, but no one had any problems, except for one of them. The one was a few miles south of our property. When I asked what happened, all he told me was that they lost a stallion a few weeks prior to my encounter. I asked him if he saw anything, and he gave me a funny look. He said it looked like a bear got at it real bad, tore up his stallion real good. I wondered if he was hiding something, hiding a story that he thought others wouldn't believe, but I didn't push the subject any further. Since then, I can't look at the woods the same way anymore. If these things are out there, who knows what else is? I don't feel safe going fishing, camping, or even horseback riding anymore. But I will say this to you. If you're outside at night, always watch your back. Werewolf in the Barn by Skylar H. I lived in South Minnesota on a private property in farm country. The property was rather large and heavily wooded in most parts. There was also a small pond and steep stream bed. It was the beginning of November when I had my encounter with this monster. My wife and I had just finished cleaning up after our yearly Halloween party. We had invited the entire family out and set up a haunted trail that the younger people in the family could enjoy. It was 2 days after the party had happened. It was about 8:50 p.m. We had finally finished storing all the decorations, and we also moved our 5 horses up to the main barn from their lockout pasture. We had put them down there so we could use the main pasture for the trail. The horses did not make it very easy, though. They bolted as soon as we opened their gate. This wasn't usually like them. We basically had to run the mile uphill to catch up. We set out fresh hay and locked them in, since there was going to be a hard freeze that night. I had just put dinner in and was enjoying some television when my phone got a text message in the kitchen. I lazily got to my feet when I heard the horses going crazy in the barn. I figured one of the farm dogs had gotten locked in with them. They do prefer to sleep on the hay instead of our carpet. I grabbed my spotlight and I walked out to the porch. Surprisingly, I found all my dogs there, all of them staring at the barn. I shined the light down into the lockout pasture and saw the horses all on one side of the corral. They were also staring at the open barn door. At that point, I was still assuming they had gotten spooked by something small, maybe a bat flying around or a tool falling off the wall. I yelled back to my wife, who was upstairs. "Something spooked the horses. I'm gonna go round them up. Can you help out?" It took her a minute to reply, saying that she'd be out in a few. I called for the dogs to come with me and started for the barn. I walked into the barn pasture, and the horses immediately trotted to crowd around me, almost pushing me over. I yelled and they backed off, giving me some space. My wife's mare, Cherry, kept rubbing her muzzle against me, eyes wide and terrified. I grabbed a nearby stool and brush and began to pat her backside, which is something she enjoyed, and I was trying to calm her down real quick. And that's when I noticed the 4 long parallel slashes going down her leg. I immediately thought there was a bear, and I shone the light into the barn. Besides a few tools and some buckets thrown around, there was nothing. I figured if there was a bear, it had smelled some of the garbage left in the upper level from the party. I was about to start to lock the horses back up when I noticed a bale of hay lying on the floor, twine still on it. It was not there when I locked them up. I went rigid and shone my light up to the loft, expecting to see a black bear, but I could only see the first couple of feet of the loft, so I had to climb up. I walked over to the ladder and noticed some dark gray hair hanging on a nail about halfway up. Right before I was about to climb up, I heard my wife behind me start to scream, along with the horses whinnying. I spun around to see her shining her own light upward to the top of the barn. "The window," she said. Drawing my courage, I climbed up the ladder, and I looked toward the window. It wasn't a bear. At first, I thought it was one of my younger relatives pulling a prank on me. But when the creature opened its mouth and started to pant like a dog, I knew it was no prank. It was about 6 feet tall and at least 200 pounds, halfway through the window of the barn loft. It was dark gray with a lighter shade around its neck. Its head was very similar to a German Shepherd, but with a much larger muzzle. And its eyes, the closest I can describe them in color, would be beer, but like someone was showing a dull yellow light through it. Those eyes were locked on me, mouth still open, revealing sharp and jagged teeth, stained light brown. It was almost leaning out of the window, one hand resting on the side. Its hands resembled almost a raccoon's hands, with long bony fingers and sharp claws. I slowly climbed back out of the barn, and I made my way to my wife. There we could still see this thing, now on the other side of the window, staring out. My wife was about to scream again, but I shot my hand back and covered her mouth. She immediately grabbed my arm and clung to me. The creature put both hands on the window, while I leaned down and whispered to my wife, "On 3, we run and we don't look back." Before I could finish the sentence, the creature had jumped down and went to all fours, growling, and we simply bolted. We ran the 25-yard gap between the house and barn in record time. The dogs had all run back to the deck and were now growling and baring their teeth at the thing. My wife reached the door first and flung it open, but when she turned to me, she screamed. I risked it, glancing back behind me, and saw that the thing was terribly close, less than 10 feet. I reached the front steps and jumped as hard and as far as I could, and thankfully landed inside with the dogs right behind me. My wife slammed the door and was then thrown back. As the door was flung back open, the thing standing up and staring down at us, baring its teeth. It wasn't all the way in, though. I jumped up and placed all my weight into the barely opened door. It shut and latched, but I soon felt something heavy outside slamming its weight against the door, and I heard the wood begin to crack. My wife thankfully had recovered and rushed to my side to set the lock in place. We then left the entryway, locking every door we saw, and ran into our kitchen. The only window there was a small one above the sink, which we hid under, hopefully out of sight of the thing. We huddled there for 3 hours, waiting and listening. Each of our dogs were set in different entryways in other rooms, all observant and waiting as well. We heard each one growling, one after the other, as if something was outside the house, walking around. Not too long after that, we heard the horses whining, followed by a loud crash. I figured they had broke down the gate and had escaped back into the pasture. We felt relieved until one of the dogs bared its teeth a moment later, and the assault on our house continued. Eventually, around midnight, when things settled down, the dogs no longer bared their teeth. We went to the bedroom, shut all the curtains, and locked the doors. We tried to sleep, but every little sound outside made me jump, and my wife was worried about our horses. Just when the sun began to rise, we managed to fall asleep. When we woke up, we immediately got dressed and went to check on the horses. They were all fine, scared but fine. We patched up Cherry, my wife's mare, with her deep gashed cuts. We went over to the barn door to see what needed fixing. But what we saw surprised us. The latch to the barn door had been undone and flipped up, the way a person would open it. No animal could do that. I realized this thing must have been quite intelligent, which made it all the more horrifying. That day we went into town. We got a deadbolt for the barn, and we went to a sporting goods store and bought a gun. After that night, we didn't have any more encounters, unless you count the horses refusing to leave the barn a few weeks later. I asked my nearby neighbors if anything strange had happened on their properties, but no one had any problems, except for one of them. The one was a few miles south of our property. When I asked what happened, all he told me was that they lost a stallion a few weeks prior to my encounter. I asked him if he saw anything, and he gave me a funny look. He said it looked like a bear got at it real bad, tore up his stallion real good. I wondered if he was hiding something, hiding a story that he thought others wouldn't believe, but I didn't push the subject any further. Since then, I can't look at the woods the same way anymore. If these things are out there, who knows what else is? I don't feel safe going fishing, camping, or even horseback riding anymore. But I will say this to you. If you're outside at night, always watch your back. I used to live in what was basically a cabin in the middle of the woods. My family had always been poor, and when my mom basically disappeared one day, my dad and I ended up moving to the cheapest place my dad could afford. That was the old cabin. It was a backwoods single-bedroom home out in the boonies of Louisiana. We lived in Missouri before this, so moving to Louisiana was quite a big change for me. It was almost always so boggy or humid outside, and the bugs were relentless. I was miserable most of the time, but far be it for me to complain, as my father did absolutely everything he could for us. He worked full-time at some sort of metal production factory. I can't quite remember what it was exactly, but that's what my childhood memory is telling me. I do remember that when he'd get home, he'd head right back out, driving a limo for folks in the nearby town during his free time. It was a weird gig, but I had an aunt that lived in town, and somehow she had a spare limo. She said she had inherited it and never used it, so she was allowing my dad to drive it as long as he gave her 10% of the earnings, which sounds extremely fair to me. I always thought it was cool seeing my father drive that limo. Prom season was quite lucrative as well, and I remember my dad always took me out for ice cream and a movie during that time each year. It was a humble life, but it was a life that allowed me to get close to my father, a time that also allowed me to explore the nature around us. It was the nature part that scared me. I was terribly afraid of the dark. As I slept in a separate bed in my dad's room, it probably didn't help. Sleeping alone was something that I wasn't used to, especially being alone at night. I didn't like it one bit. What really creeped me out was the shed in the backyard. It resembled one of those typical outhouses from the Tom and Jerry cartoons. It stood just a few yards from the edge of the tree line, ominously, wood missing in places, and wasps usually overrunning it during the summer. Little did I know when we moved in that there was far more to that shed, but I would soon learn as the first winter at the cabin approached. Now, winter in Louisiana can be really cold at times, or even warm some years, but seemingly never in between from what I experienced. That year was a cold one, though. Around that time, Dad had begun construction on the side of the cabin, putting down rebar, then concrete, and in no time, my dad was putting the finishing touches on what was to be my room. Honestly, though, I wasn't excited. I should have been, but the thought of being left alone, especially on the opposite side of the cabin from my father, it didn't sit well with me. Yet, whenever my dad asked about me looking forward to my room, or how I was going to decorate it, I would always be sure to reply with a smile and a "thank you, Daddy." When my room was finished, I toughed it out and readily settled into my new room, moving my bed and blankets and pillows from Dad's room. The walls were bare and it was cold, but the room was much newer and nicer than the rest of the cabin. I was grateful. It was on that first night when I slept in my room. I was finally about to fall asleep when I heard something that woke me up into a cold sweat. The sound reminded me of our old dog that had passed away, the way he'd claw on the back door to get us to open it. Except this sound was much heavier. There was far more weight behind it. I listened closely, my mouth opening further by the moment. Soon I realized it was coming from outside. My father had placed a window in my room on the north side, and I had made sure to sleep at an angle on a wall where I couldn't see outside that window. But as the sound continued, I found myself climbing out of bed and approaching the window to see outside. At the window, the moon was incredibly bright and shone our backyard almost like it was daytime, almost. I looked to my left toward the tree line where the shed was, and of course, that's where the noise was coming from. But as I stare into the distance at the shed, I can see something causing the door to move. Then suddenly, the door gave way and whatever it was stepped inside, after which the door fell back to its original position. It happened suddenly, so I hadn't seen what crawled into the shed. But I do know that when the door fell shut again with the thing inside, the clawing sound stopped. There was an animal inside our shed. I ran out of my room, not entirely scared per se, but definitely curious and a bit worried. I ran to my father's room straight away, only to find a note taped to his door. It said, "Gray, I'll be back before morning, maybe before you even see this. Auntie had a heart attack. Promise I'll be back before breakfast." Come on, Dad, I thought. Why couldn't he have just woke me up, or maybe even brought me with him, or at least told me? He overthought things sometimes. So I was alone at the cabin, and there was something in the shed maybe 20 yards from my bedroom window. It's just a dog, I told myself. Well, if it was just a dog, it'd be fine if I went outside and checked on it. For the first time in my life, my curiosity was overpowering my fear. Maybe I was finally growing up, because part of me that night genuinely felt a bit of excitement at the idea of exploring this mystery on my own. After all, if I knew what it was or wasn't, I would be able to sleep better. So that's what I did. I made that horror movie mistake that makes you want to scream at the screen from your seat on the couch. I grabbed my father's flashlight and I walked outside. I know you're probably rolling your eyes. I regret doing this, believe me. But there was some sort of confidence in me that night. A confidence that hasn't returned since, and you'll soon see why. Outside it was pretty nippy, but I had my jacket and slippers on, so I made my way steadily to the shed. After rounding the corner of the cabin, I could see it there in the moonlight. It didn't look so bad, the shed. It was the woods around me that were far more intimidating. My confidence continued to drive me, though. It drove me until I made it to the entrance of the shed. There, I could see at least 3 abandoned wasp nests just from that spot. Luckily, most creepy crawlies were dormant at the time, except for whatever was in the shed. I wasn't about to yank the door open. Definitely not. Instead, I'd slowly open it and peek in with my flashlight. Who knows what the animal inside would do if I startled it? Slow and steady, I reminded myself. I grabbed the handle of the door, which felt like it could come off if I gave it a good yank. I slowly pushed the shed door inward and shone the flashlight on every inch of the inside. My heart was pounding so hard, it sounded like a distant drum beat in my ear. As my pulse raced, the door widened, and soon I saw it. There was nothing in the shed. My hands fell to my side. Had I been dreaming the whole thing? Had it left before I got outside? Maybe it was just the wind after all. I exhaled and almost laughed. I got all worked up and brave for nothing. Just before I closed the shed door, before I walked mindlessly back inside to a peaceful night's sleep, my light caught something that reflected the light. Eyes. Eyes coming from the ground. I was frozen. I stood still, microscopically moving my hand until the light showed me where the eyes were coming from. There was a face in the ground. When I saw it, I began to cry. It was definitely a face, the face of something that looked like it had buried itself in the dirt face up. Its eyes were wide open now, and their attention was entirely focused on me. What was I even looking at? I remember thinking. Its face looked like it had been stretched like pizza dough, only for it to dry that way. In the lighting, its skin was a mix of deep purple and brown, an unnatural shade for the skin of any healthy animal. And its teeth were horrible, and it was showing them to me in a silent snarl. It didn't seem to be happy that I was in its shed, and it seemed to be telling me to get out. That was it for me. I took its warning, running for my life back into our cabin. Once inside, I locked the door, and I crawled into my dad's bed for the remainder of that night. I didn't even try to go back to sleep. Rather, I listened for anything that sounded like movement. But the only sound that came around 5 hours later. It was the scratching again, followed by the sound of the shed door closing back in place, then very faint footsteps disappearing into the trees. And that was it. I know you want to hear more. You want to hear that I heard it and saw it again, but I didn't. I never had to worry about it again after that. Something tells me that once it saw me, once it discovered that someone found its sleeping spot, it didn't want to come back. Was it scared of me? I mean, something with a face like that. I wouldn't think it'd be scared of anything. Be careful if you live in the woods in northern Louisiana. Something is looking for a place to sleep. Is That a Werewolf? By Yona. I live in Delhi, India. A couple of months ago, my best friend Varuna and I were sitting in our room studying for our upcoming finals. With only a couple of weeks left, we were extremely stressed and stayed up for hours that night to prepare. It was our college graduation exams, and we both were pursuing the same subject, living in the same apartment complex and going to the same college. I've known Varuna since we were kids. We met during our kindergarten years, so we were quite close. So it was a long night of preparation, and we were sitting in our living room studying. Our apartment was on the 5th floor, which faces a huge empty plot of land. The only trees present in that land are big coconut trees. The ground is full of tall grasses which cover up the land. There is a huge pond in the middle as well. When we first moved in, that piece of land was seriously spooky, as there were no houses, and there were tons of wild foxes that lived out there. We could hear them barking or screaming every night, which is pretty chilling the first time you hear it, but we both grew used to it. To separate the land from our complex, there was a huge 6-foot wall which prevents the foxes from coming in. From our living room terrace, we could see the foxes running around looking for food. It was around 2:30 a.m. and Varuna and I were chugging coffee and quizzing each other, and the foxes started howling and barking. We didn't pay attention to them, and instead tried to focus. Usually they do this at intervals every night, so it was nothing new. However, this time, they didn't stop barking. Usually they'd stop after maybe a couple of minutes, but they were at it for literally an hour. The complex is new and not many people live here, not to mention the street was pretty far away, so there was no noise from the vehicles or other people. That night, their continuous barking really irked us because we were trying to concentrate. To make matters worse, the stray dogs that lived around our complex began barking back at them. Our complex is full of them because it's still under construction, and they get a lot of food from the workers and a few people that live here. We have 2 Labrador retrievers as well, Danny and Drogo, yes, named from Game of Thrones. They rushed to the terrace and their back hair was standing up. We didn't pay them much attention at first, but after a while, we walked over to the terrace to bring them back in before they started barking like crazy. I got them on their leashes and tried to control them, afraid they'd take off or jump from the terrace. I got them back inside. Then Varuna and I went back outside. We wanted to know if there was something they were all barking at, to see if it wasn't just some argument between the foxes and dogs. At first, we saw a few foxes running around. Then suddenly, we saw a massive figure standing up from the ground. Honestly, I thought it was a person at first, but then it stood up, and it appeared to be holding something in its mouth, something that I soon realized was the body of a fox. We stood there staring at it without making so much as a whimper. That's when our dogs decided to empty their lungs at this thing. The creature turned at us, glaring at us, and I could see it had a long snout, shabby rusty gray hair, and pointed ears. Its eyes held such a malicious gaze and looked almost silvery in color. It looked like it was breathing heavily and growling at the same time. We watched it pull the fox from its mouth with an especially sharp, clawed hand. "What on earth are we looking at?" Varuna basically screeched beside me, digging her nails into my arms and breaking me out of my shock. The beast turned, got down on the ground, and began running. We could see it going further away as it broke the grass and trampled on it, running at full speed. We were soon left standing there, staring into a now empty field. The dogs had stopped barking and were now nuzzling my leg, trying to get my attention. I noticed their tails had been tucked under their bodies. We went to the rooms and started closing the windows and pulling the curtains back. I've never been so scared in my life. Even though we saw the thing run away, we were sure it'd be back, especially with all the foxes in that field. We switched off the lights and sat on the sofa, not really speaking for a long time. We could still hear the distant barking and howling of the foxes, but they soon gave up as well. We fell asleep on the couch that night together and woke up quite late. Varuna was still shaken up by the experience and wanted to go investigate, but I didn't want to go out there, daylight or nighttime. What if that thing came back and we were there? We waited for 2 weeks to see if it would come back, but we never saw it again, and I can't be any more thankful for that. This took place, from what I can remember, 10 years ago. I was living in Wales at the time, and behind my house was a massive field which you could walk to. It would lead you to the doctors and the church. At night, the field used to give me the creeps, as it would always be reflected in the dark as something you would see in a horror film, like the water glowing in the moonlight and the darkness casted over the field. Always made me wonder what could be hiding out there. I was 12 years old at the time. I used to enjoy playing in the field with my dog Millie. She was a rough collie who was getting to quite an old age, but she had plenty of playfulness left in her old self. She and I went into the field at night. It was our nightly routine. To give an overview of my old house, there were steps from the back door to the road behind the back garden. You would walk past a tree line, then the metal gate to the field was there. We took a walk into the field one night, and it was quite fun. We did the usual games anyone would do with their dogs, like fetch the stick, run and chase, and other fun games. I really miss her. The field was only partially well lit that night by the nearby street lamps, but the back area was dark and quite spooky. I would often hear noises from the field which could range from howling to whispers, but I would shrug it off as a farmer and his animals, as across the small stream was a farm. When I was about to venture further into the field, Millie suddenly began to growl. Now, Millie was getting old, and her eyesight was partially gone by then, but she stayed almost still and snarling at something in the darkness. I said to her, "Calm down, girl. It's just the farmer and maybe his dog." But when I looked in the direction she was looking at, I froze. Standing there was a man, but the thing about the man was his arms and posture. The guy was hunched over, and his arms stretched to about his legs. I shouted out to him, "Hello? My dog means you no harm, I apologize. She's just not used to seeing anybody at this time of night." The guy muttered back to me part of it, saying under his breath, "Means no harm." Panic began to set in. I tried to play it off as me overreacting, but when the man changed, he was no longer a man. I saw parts of him tearing and breaking into different shapes. He fell down on his arms, and his back legs stretched up past his back. The human silhouette I was looking at was now gone, and replaced with something that resembled only vaguely a wolf. Then it screeched, forcing my hands quickly up to my ears to protect them from the awful noise. Then it jumped at us. I began to run with Millie in tow. We got over the fence with me lifting Millie over, who was very big, but not impossible to lift. I ran back through my garden, locked the gate, and ran up the stairs. I looked back from the top, and the thing was there partially illuminated in the light. I could see it staring at me, and then it ran back into the field. My dad heard the commotion and ran to the kitchen, asking me what was wrong. I told him, and he just told me that I was seeing things and to go to bed. I listened to him, and that night was full of creepy events. The first was around midnight. I was thirsty and went down for a glass of water. As I headed down to the kitchen, I heard a tapping at the back door. At first, I heard my dad's voice asking me to let him in, as he had forgotten his keys. I thought, wait a minute, my mom and dad would be asleep right now, in the room across from mine. I crept back through the lounge and back up the stairs to my room, then looked out my bedroom window, which overlooked my back garden, including the back door. I looked and there was the same man from the field before, but he was looking at me, and I quickly closed my window and drew my curtains. The man had a crooked mouth and eyes that glowed yellow from the street lamps. I hid under my covers, and eventually, maybe after a couple of hours, fell asleep. The second event happened the next night. I was in bed early after a long day of school, as well as multiple chores around the house, including walking the dog and shopping down at the local grocery. I fell asleep, but around 1 in the morning, I woke up and decided to play some PS2. I believe I was playing Resident Evil 4 and was enjoying the game when I muttered under my breath, "Just a zombie." Then I heard a voice trying to mimic what I had said. "Just a zombie." I paused my game and was shaking as I noticed that that was the same voice from the previous night. I looked outside the window, and it was there again, the man or not-so-man thing. I could see its silhouette peeking in through my window, and it stayed there until it moved an hour later and I was able to get some sleep. Finally, the last event occurred when I was at home on my own. My dad was working, and my mom went to see my cousin a few miles away, so I was home alone. I was playing on my trampoline, and then went to my room to have a gaming night. My dad was not due to be home until midnight, and my mom would pick him up after he caught the bus to his job, which was about 15 miles away in another town. I settled down with a big pizza and my own custom-made Coke mango mix, with ice in a big pint glass. I was playing some games, when all of a sudden, I heard a knock at the back door, and thought, maybe Mom forgot something. I made my way down, and then I froze. Wait, Mom went to see my cousin, and my dad was working late tonight. Even if they wanted to come back, it wouldn't be this early, as the buses stopped after 6. I recalled the last 2 nights with that thing, and I peeked behind the lounge door, but I saw nothing. I thought it was my imagination, but then someone called my name. It said it in the same eerie voice as before. "Joshua." I looked at the back door again, and the thing was there. Millie was barking at it after it began tapping, and I called her to quietly follow me. She listened and came to me, whimpering, but I told her it'd be okay. I took her and my cat, who was hissing at the thing, upstairs, and I locked the door. I waited there for so long, lights off and windows drawn. I then heard more of those gross snapping sounds, as the thing was probably changing again. It freaked me out so bad that I got up and checked the door again, just to make sure it was locked. Then came the screeching. I looked out the window, and I saw its silhouette speeding off into the fields. Luckily, right after that, I saw the headlights of my mom and her car pulling up behind the back gate. I ran out to ask her if she had seen that, but she said she hadn't. I was relieved at least to see my mother, but was irritated by what I alone kept witnessing. Almost 7 years later, at 19, I had to know what I saw all those years ago, and after asking around and explaining my experiences, people were telling me that it sounded like the Skinwalker from America. Surely it couldn't be that. But after some research and thought, I realized that many different cultures have their own shapeshifters, and the UK is no exception. All in all, I'm happy we moved back to England. Whenever I do visit this area, the field has been locked firmly, and I choose to keep my distance. I just hope no one fell victim to that human wolf-changing thing. I've had a number of strange experiences since I moved to the country in central Wisconsin, but this one is by far the most terrifying. This place used to be an operating farm. We are surrounded by fields and woods. Across the road to the east is a large field where I used to go to get good views of the night sky. There are old barns and sheds in the yard that my landlord just uses for storage now. The biggest barn, the one in the northeast quadrant of the yard, has always given me the creeps, especially at night. All of us just naturally avoid going near it, even during the day. Between the barn and the road to the east, there's a fair amount of clear lawn, but it's just an unspoken rule that we don't go over there unless absolutely necessary, because it just feels wrong. This first experience wasn't as bad, but I feel it's important to mention, as it's likely that it is connected to the next one. It was the middle of the 2017 winter, and I had just gotten home from Taekwondo. It was only about 8 or 9 p.m. I stepped out of my car and opened the back door to grab my school stuff, along with my sparring gear. At first, I thought everything was normal, until I heard a sound. It was like a ticking-ish sound, which I assumed was fine, because my car made that noise while cooling off all the time. But then I realized that this ticking sound was not coming from my car, and it began to pick up pace. It quickly turned into what sounded like a growl. It was coming from the far side of that barn, the creepy old barn. Then it became snarling. Needless to say, fearing for my safety, I dropped everything, slammed the car door, and bolted inside the house. Now, we have coyotes and foxes around here, but they stay far, far away from any houses, well, usually. But that growl, it was way too deep and loud to be a coyote. Even still, I tried my best to convince myself that that's all it was. Now, on to the following summer. I'd gotten myself a telescope for Christmas, since nothing excites me more than astronomy, and I brought a friend over so we could use it to look at some nebulae, and maybe even the 4 planets that were supposed to be visible that night. The sky was clear, and it was the perfect temperature for some observations. It was about 10 or 11 o'clock. First, we took the telescope into the backyard, but we could not get a good view of Mars from there due to the nearby tree cover. So we decided to go to the east field, across the street. It was free of trees over there, and as I said earlier, offered an amazing view of the sky. I picked up the telescope, and my friend went ahead of me, watching for dog piles in the yard, so I wouldn't step in a pile of yuck. We walked up the driveway towards the road. Halfway across the road, we began to hear something that made us stop in our tracks. It was this demented mix between a growl, a hiss, and a snarl. It was coming from the ditch nearby. This sound made me jump backwards with the telescope still in my arms. My friend cursed under her breath before dashing back a few meters. I was frozen in the middle of the road, staring at the spot where the sound had originated from. She grabbed my arm, saying, "Go, start walking. I'll watch your back." Her grip on my arm was so tight, it snapped me out of my trance. Steadily, I turned back toward the house, speed walking as fast as possible now, without dropping the telescope. Halfway down the driveway, I heard my friend harshly whisper, "Oh my God, Alaric, there are eyes there. I see eyes in that ditch." I paused at this to look over my shoulder and see what she was talking about. And sure enough, there were eyes reflecting a yellowish silver, staring at us from that ditch. We got inside safely and shut the curtains. We did not want to see what that thing actually was. That field is long, and near the far end, it slopes downward pretty drastically. I've been out there enough times to know this pretty well. Anyway, that night I had to take my friend home. But as you could probably guess, we did not want to leave the house again. As we ran at full speed to my car, she stayed behind me, clutching tightly to my sweater, which is extremely uncharacteristic of her. She was almost as petrified as I was. As I turned my car around in the driveway, she said it again. "Those eyes are out there. It's still watching us." As I neared the edge of the driveway, I saw what she was talking about. Farther back in the field, those same eyes, somehow brighter than before, were looking back at us. I stopped the car at the end of the driveway as it continued to stare us down. The creature was far back in that field. Based on the sloping of the field and just how high above the ground the eyes appeared, this creature was 8 or 9 feet from the ground, and as there was nothing to climb on there, this animal, this monster, was tall, with unrealistically large yellow-silver eyes. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. As we stared at it, the eyes quickly lowered. It only took us a few seconds to see that the creature was coming closer to us. As I hit the gas, we saw the way its eyes moved. They moved in a figure-8 pattern, the way something does if it's lumbering on 2 large legs. That gait of a massive weight shifting left, then right as it approached. I had never been so afraid at my own home. We floored it out of the driveway. I took my friend home, and I didn't come back home myself until daylight. What's worse about this is that later on, when it began to snow, I started to find huge footprints in the snow near my house. These prints are definitely not human. They're way bigger than human prints would be, and they do not match the prints of any animal that I've seen. Just the other night, I saw those prints near our barn. They walked across the driveway, and they stopped near my front door before going back the way they came. Every time I come home at night, I find myself repeating a mantra of, "Please don't see it. Please don't let me see it," while obsessively watching, staring at the field. I never want to see this thing's face, but those prints are getting closer every day. I feel like I'm going to have to see it soon, whether I like it or not. Needless to say, I do not go near my field at night anymore. The Observer. Submitted by Nostalgia. First off, I need to say that this isn't my own story. I know that can make it sound like it may be doubtful, but I promise it's true. This was told to me by two of the people in the world I trust most, my two cousins, in complete honesty and fear. One night, my family gathered for a carne asada. It's like a barbecue. We were eating and sharing stories. Then my cousin, Danny, asked in all seriousness, "Do you want to hear a scary thing that happened to me and Elisa, her sister?" And of course, you don't say no to something like that. Me and several others were very interested, and we were listening intently to their story. She begins. She was washing the dishes in the afternoon. A window sits right in front of the sink, looking out over the yard. All of a sudden, she sees someone walk across the window, right in front of it. It looked like Elisa. She was even wearing her favorite yellow teddy bear shirt, but she was strange, oddly stiff, as if she didn't know how to act in her own body. She continued across the yard and out of the window's view. Danny, thinking she's going to go to the back door to enter the house, waits to hear her come inside. But she never hears anything. Instead, she hears the bathroom door open, and to her horror, that's Elisa, and she's coming out casually smiling. She tries to explain what she just saw to Elisa, that she saw her outside, and that there was no way she could have been coming from the bathroom. But Elisa doesn't believe her, and passes it off as her imagining something or just seeing shadows. Months later, Danny experienced another bizarre encounter. This time, she was out in the city center in San Luis with her friends after school. They were trying to get a taxi when one of her friends interrupts the chatting and gets her attention. "Hey, isn't that Elisa?" she says, pointing across the road. Danny, confused, looks across to see her sister at the bus stop, among other people. She's standing there, furiously waving, stiffly with large eyes and a forced large smile on her face. It was eerie, not normal, not Elisa. It was like she wanted her attention urgently. Danny waved awkwardly back, unsure of how to respond exactly. When the taxi arrived and they got in, everyone was equally confused and freaked out. They all knew Elisa hated the bus. She felt it was disgusting and not to her standard. She would never be riding in one, let alone trying to show others she was riding one. They argue about whether that was her, but Danny assures it was. It looked physically like her sister, anyway. It just didn't behave like her, as if she was possessed. The last encounter didn't happen for a few years. Danny was now married, and her husband Marco, and Elisa were all going to be staying in their childhood home, which is also where the initial window encounter had happened. Danny and her husband were sleeping in her old bedroom. It was dark and had 2 beds. After a long nap, she gets up and heads for the bathroom, which is to the right of her room. Before she goes to open the door, she feels the need to look toward the small living room, located to the left of their room with the front door between. The house wasn't large, and the living room was visible from her doorway. She turns to look, and standing there is Elisa, but she knew right away it was the other Elisa. She calls her name anyway, just in case. Elisa? And this thing stares at Danny. It stares hard at her, as if she had been caught red-handed. Danny was so frightened, she said she couldn't even move. Then the fake Elisa reacted. It bent itself, like when you're pretending to be a dinosaur. Its legs bent and its arms pulled inwards. Danny said she felt cold all of a sudden, like everything inside her had frozen, and she couldn't breathe. Then the thing tilted its head and jumped. Yes, she said it jumped like some sort of kangaroo. It looked so unnatural and forced, bizarre for any person to ever do. It quickly reached her, and they were face to face, inches apart, and it began to scream. Danny felt like she was going to pass out and yelled, "Yvette, get out!" Danny then heard a door behind her open, and there was Elisa. She looked just as confused. Danny looked awful, and Elisa rushed over to see what was wrong. She looked pale and sick, and she couldn't speak, only cry. But the thing that had been Elisa, it was gone. Finally, after a few hours, she calmed down enough to explain what happened to Elisa and Marcos, who also was worried and confused. She tried to retell what happened as calmly as she could. Elisa believed in her encounters after hearing about the bus incident from her and Danny's friends. That's when Danny's husband Marco added in an extra eerie note to the story. He says that while he and Danny were sleeping, he woke up in the middle of the night and saw someone standing in their room. It was Elisa. He figured she was back from shopping, so he didn't pay much mind. But then she walked closer, leaned over Marco, and strangely looked towards Danny, eyes wide and quizzical. After a few minutes, Elisa retreated and headed for the closet next to the bed. Then, once in there, began furiously going through everything, thrashing clothes and throwing things out, looking at one thing then another. Then he knew it wasn't Elisa, the way it suddenly stiffened up and walked out of the room, as if this was its first experience moving with a human body. Marco tried to assume it was Elisa, checking to see if Danny was still sleeping and went to look for something, though it was impossible to ignore the way she acted and moved. They haven't seen this mimic creature since, and they don't know where it came from, or why it copied Elisa and haunted Danny. As we discussed it, I stated that it may have been an alien or something trying to learn from her and understand her lifestyle, or some sort of Mexican skinwalker. Either way, this was a very bizarre experience, and it's very troubling to know there are things out there that can easily disguise themselves as your loved ones. For what reason, I don't think we'll ever know, not unless it's too late. Little Creatures from Mexico, submitted by Al. My mother has told me this story various times, especially since it's one of my favorites. Not too long ago, around 3 years ago, my mother received a phone call late in the evening from a relative in Mexico. I asked her what it was about, and she told me she would tell me in the morning. The next day I asked her about it, and she replied in Spanish, "If I tell you, you better not come to me at night saying you're scared." Immediately curious, I promised that I wouldn't. But of course, that was a lie, and even as a grown adult, I still seek her protection when I'm scared and think of this story. She told me that her niece, who was an infant, was staying at my grandma's house for a while, and one day, in the middle of the night, my grandma and my uncles and aunts awoke to the sound of small bells and laughter, the sound of feet running around her small adobe home. In Mexico, duendes are known to make these sounds and are notorious for claiming the souls of children, especially when the child had not been properly protected while having crossed a river with their parents. And in fact, earlier that day, they had passed by the river near my grandma's house without even bothering to protect the child from the duendes. They had forgotten the words of advice many elders have told them before. Adults are usually warned not to bring children in or around rivers, since chanos, duendes, goblins, elves, and gnomes, are notorious for kidnapping children, and as I said before, the souls of infants. If a person were to cross the river with their child infant, without saying, "Don't stay in the river or the chanos will take you," they're in danger. The infant's soul is usually stuck in the river, and the infant will cry throughout the night until the duendes, goblins, elves, and chanos retrieve the infant from its home. In order to prevent this from happening, you must go back with the infant and speak those words at the river you crossed with the child in your arms. There is also a plant called jarral. It grows along the rivers that protects the child's soul from staying in the water. According to many elders, the infant child must be wearing it for the chant or words to work. My aunts and uncles had ignored the sounds of the chanos, and they went back to sleep, thinking nothing of it at the time. The next morning, they had found her by the door. Her niece had been dragged out of her bed and placed at the front door. My grandma believes the chanos tried taking her back to the river, since it was impossible for the newborn to crawl from her mother's bed to the door that was near the other side of the house. I honestly fear these creatures, and I know I will have to visit my grandma one day, and that gives me chills, especially since aliens, duendes, demons, and lechuza, and pretty much anything you can think of, are known inhabitants of that rural area in which my grandma lives. I don't think I'll be too excited to get there. The Old Chop Tank Ghost, submitted by Sarah N. Maryland is full of strange stories, myths, and legends, but one of the most culturally important facts of my state is you can't throw a rock without hitting something that is haunted. I grew up on the eastern shore in Caroline County, which meant I spent a lot of time running around the woods and on, in, or near the Chop Tank River. Looking back on it, that river was filthy and dangerous, and the fact that I nor any of my friends got ill or drowned is a miracle in and of itself. Regardless, I remember the first time I went to my best friend's grandma's and was blown away by her beautiful home right on the river, nestled in the woods. It was gorgeous. It was just outside of town and was near enough to Denton that we could always find some trouble to get into. Unfortunately for us, trouble was a lot closer than we had anticipated. One night in the early fall, I decided to spend the night with a new friend of mine who would eventually become like a sister to me. Her name was Victoria. Victoria lived with her grandmother, and it wasn't until after graduation that we had become very close. The minute I first stepped onto their property, I was blown away by it. Its beauty distracted me initially from the sense of being watched that seemed to intensify the closer night came. The afternoon wore on like any other. We watched movies, talked about colleges, and stuffed our faces with snacks. But as night began to fall, Victoria looked at me and said, "Hey, bet you didn't know the woods around this house are haunted." "Really?" I asked, looking nervously out the kitchen window. At this time, I was already intrigued by the woods, but the aspect of the possible paranormal activity, it just made me more excited and nervous. I've had strange encounters in the woods before, so at the time, I had a strangely apprehensive love of the forest. Yeah, They say you can hear drums being played, and that sometimes you'll see Indians running around," she said. "Want to go for a walk out there?" I looked up at the sky and noticed that it was just about fully dark out, so hopped up on pixie sticks, soda, and a stupid false bravado. I cheekily laughed and asked her where they kept the flashlights. Once we managed to find a working flashlight, we set out on our adventure. Off in the distance, we could hear the marching band practicing across the river at the high school. With a smile, I mentioned that the band could be the source of those drums she was talking about, or it could just be the cars going over the bridge a mile down the river. Victoria shrugged and looked at me strangely as we entered the woods. Confused, I wrote it off, and I followed her. The difference between the tail end of sunset in the yard and the nearly impenetrable darkness under the trees was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Worried, I kept close to my friend as we walked in deeper. As we walked, I found out things about her that she hadn't told anyone else, most of which was private, but as we exchanged secrets, I noticed movement in the dark. Every time I looked, whatever it was would be gone. At this point, I was nervous but excited. I pointed it out to Victoria, who said she was seeing it as well. We pressed farther in when I began to hear something. It was a strange thud-like sound that boomed in the distance. I listened, trying to hear the rest of the band, but other than the distant booming noise, the woods were eerily silent. I looked at Victoria, who kept looking around even more nervously than before. Finally, I asked her, "What's wrong?" She looked at me for a moment in surprise, like she had forgotten I was with her. Before she could open her mouth to speak, everything went completely silent, even the band in the distance, even the nighttime noises such as crickets and animals. All of it instantly faded. It was like a blanket covered our world. We both turned our heads simultaneously to look down the path we had been walking on, and there, standing in the middle of the path ahead of us, was nothing. We could clearly see that something was supposed to be there, but the only way I had ever been able to describe what we saw was a 7-foot-tall void. No dark shadows, no physical form, just nothing. From that nothing came the very real sense that we were not welcome here. I could feel this thing getting angrier by the second, so finally, I leaned over to Victoria and asked her, "You see that too, right?" "Yeah," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to leave." To our credit, we didn't run. She and I simply turned around and began to walk back the way we came. After we walked for about 10 minutes, we were only 20 meters away from the head of the trail, and we could see the light of the yard lamps in front of the house, when Victoria stopped suddenly. I turned to look at her. She was hunched over, her whole body convulsing as she mumbled under her breath. I didn't look back up the path to see if the thing had followed us. I instead focused on my friend. "Victoria, what's wrong?" I asked again, putting my arms around her shoulders to try and pull her forward. If you've ever dunked your arm into an icy pool in the middle of winter, you have some idea of what the air felt like at the back of Victoria's neck. She panicked and thrashed a bit as I yanked my arm back. Don't, he doesn't want me to leave again," she said, shivering and crying. Determined, I reached over her again and tried to pull her. Victoria was a tiny thing, barely $120, and I, being much taller and stronger, could have easily moved her on any given day. Except that night, Victoria didn't budge. She didn't stumble or even lean forward. I may as well have been trying to move the oak tree next to us. She cried out again, and I removed my arm. "He's angry," she said, before she started mumbling to herself again. I stood there, unable to help as my friend tried to free herself. Feeling at a loss, I simply stood next to her, pressing my arm against hers and trying to give her whatever support she needed. When I did that, I could feel a looming pressure at my back, that cold and icy feeling slithering down my spine like cold acid. But I refused to move. After what seemed like an eternity, Victoria stumbled forward, almost as if she had been pushed, and I jumped into action. I grabbed her arm and steadied her as we ran the remaining distance to the head of the trail. Once we were out under the stars, we relaxed a bit and slowed to a fast walk as we made our way back to her yard and the safety of home. Victoria was so out of breath and exhausted, she looked as though she had run a marathon. Whatever it was had sapped her of her strength. Curious, I glanced back into the woods, and to this day, part of me wishes I hadn't. Behind us, about 10 paces back, hovered a tall column of smoke. In it were tendrils of red that danced like fire. I could barely make out a face in the smoke, a face that glared at me and shook me to my core. I stared for a moment, unsure if the thing was going to attack or not. I managed to turn and began to bustle my friend back into her yard even more quickly. I tried to take her into the house, but she refused and instead ran to her car. Once we were both inside, she grabbed her rosary that her grandfather had given her and began to pray. I looked back beyond the yard, but the spirit was gone. Thankfully, Victoria calmed down. She explained that her grandfather had been a priest and an exorcist. When she was little, she'd had issues with the spirits in the woods. In order to protect her, her grandfather blessed their property and told her to stay out of the woods. And until now, she had. Fast forward about 10 years, and I find myself sitting in a car outside those same woods. I had told some of my friends about the encounter, and they were eager to have an experience of their own. I, though, was reluctant to go back. I hadn't been back in these particular woods since the incident, despite spending a lot of time on the property and growing close to her family. When we parked, I got out of the car and froze. That same feeling of, "you're not welcome here," hit me like a ton of bricks, and I stared at the head of the trail Victoria and I had taken so long ago. It was black, pitch black, and off in the distance I could hear the thud-like booming sound of what I can only assume were drums. I got back into my car, made a fool of myself in a panic, and happily watched the tree line fade away in our taillights while my friends grumbled in the front seat, having been denied their adventure. I didn't care. I'd gotten the distinct feeling that this time, the spirit in those woods would not be as merciful. I don't mind the forest. I love the trees and the sounds and smells and the energy overall. But I also know where I'm not welcome, and I will never go back into those woods, aside from the danger of sinkholes and mud traps and dangerous undertows in the river. There are lingering forces that we cannot begin to comprehend, forces that lurk just beyond our senses. Sometimes they're happy for the company you bring, and other times they'd rather you leave and never come back. The Talking Branch, submitted by Kara. This happened when I was 7 years old. Back then, I lived in a 2-story apartment. We lived on the top floor, and the apartment next to us was connected by a patio. My sisters and I loved playing on the patio, and we were always seen there. But something I encountered there has changed my view on the once light and happy playground of my childhood. One day, I was outside on my patio alone, playing near our neighbor's house. They had a little walkway that led to the back door. In that walkway were a pair of bikes, maybe a few sandals and a branch from the tree growing next to the apartment, It was long and stretched all the way into the middle of the walkway. It was just resting there until I saw it beginning to shake, like wind was causing it to move up and down. Thing was, there was no wind that day. As I stared at it, I heard a voice coming from the walkway. I was certain there was no one else there, and the voice was about a yard away from me. It was raspy and rather high-pitched. Sadly, or maybe fortunately, I can't remember what the voice said for the life of me. As a kid, I never really listened to what people said. But I do remember one word, something along the lines of, listening. I wish I could remember everything that it said, everything it wanted to tell me. But as a kid, I thought it was the branch talking, so I dubbed it the talking branch. Years later, I discovered a show called A Haunting and became very fascinated with the paranormal. After putting the pieces of the puzzle together, I found out it was probably a demon or spirit that spoke to me that day. I shuddered, scared like I wasn't before. I probably should have been scared when I heard it. One of these otherworldly things spoke to me. When I knew that, I wanted to know even more what it was saying to me, but at the same time, I wanted to just forget, since I know where this thing might come from. When I was talking with my family about their experiences with the other side, my mom said she had heard a raspy voice say her name a long time ago, before she was married. I'm a very good voice impressionist. I'm able to mimic quite a few of my favorite cartoon voices. One voice that I'm able to mimic perfectly is the talking branch. I had been practicing it because I was so curious and spooked by my previous experience. I mimicked that voice for my mom that night, and I asked her, was this the voice? And she nodded yes, with a terrified look on her face. It just makes me wonder if the talking branch was the same voice that spoke to her. Later on, I was able to move past it and just accept that it was part of my past. But I can't help but wonder if I will ever hear that voice again. In the Woods of Louisiana. Submitted by Johnny. I remember my childhood very clearly. I remember the huge Victorian-style home that I grew up in. It was in a big patch of woods in northern Louisiana. Most of the trees were very tall pine trees. I remember they smelled so sweet. Our house was about 5 miles away from neighbors on all sides, and the only way to reach it besides a trek through the woods was a tiny dirt road that led from the main highway to our house. It was an absolutely beautiful setting for a beautiful home. The sun would burst through the trees, and now that I think about it, even during the height of Louisiana summer or the middle of winter, the area always felt as if it was fall, maybe a solid 68 degrees all year round, which is strange, really. I was a rambunctious child, 8 years old at the time, with a huge imagination. This huge imagination would be the explanation given to me by my mother when I told her that there were children living in the woods around our home. I've only ever spoken of this to my mother, and even now, writing about it, there are memories flooding back to me that I have somehow completely erased. There were vampires in those woods around my home. I'm sure of it. One bright but cool August day, I decided to play outside with our husky puppy, Marcella. We called her Marcy. My mother gave me her usual stay close to the house and don't go into the woods warning, and I bolted out the door with Marcy. My mother always reminded me that there were black bears in the woods, and to never go farther than the edge of them, which literally surrounded our entire house besides the small dirt road. I remember seeing at least 2 black bears, but that's beside the point. Marcy and I were playing fetch one day with an old baseball that I had, and my last toss was a little too hard. The ball whizzed past Marcy and rolled into the thick woods behind my home. Marcy ran for it, but stopped dead in her tracks right at the edge of the brush and began to snarl. The hairs on her back stood up, and I remember being filled with a sense of panic. "Marcy, what's wrong?" I asked. Right after I spoke, I heard a snap in the woods, and fear took over me. I screamed for Marcy to come back and ran for the door to my house. Right before I closed the door, I saw the baseball roll back into my yard from the woods. After that, I didn't go outside for a while. After a few days of hiding, my mother convinced me that it was probably an animal and that it was long gone by now. I remember the feeling of dread and panic that came over me, and the deep growls coming from Marcy. That was no normal animal out there. Being a bored child, though, I decided to venture back into the yard. My grandfather was a huge gardener, and I collected seeds and small tools from him on my yearly visits, so I decided to make a small garden myself. It was about 5 in the afternoon, and I knew the sun would be setting about 2 hours from then. I found a small patch of flat yard next to the tree line behind my home, and I began digging small holes to plant lily bulbs. I became so caught up in gardening that time seemed to move faster and faster. Before I knew it, the sun was setting and twilight was approaching. As I realized this, I began to collect my tools and leftover bulbs to put them away. Just as I grabbed the last tool and turned to walk away, I heard what sounded like a child's voice. "Hi," said the voice. It came from the woods right behind me. I snapped my head around in surprise. "Hello?" I asked. "Hi," I heard, just as I saw a small girl peek around a thick pine tree. She looked to be around 6 or 7 years old, with long, ratty brown hair and dirty skin. She looked as though she'd been walking the woods for weeks. I remember her so clearly now. I remember her facial features were almost elf-like. She had a small nose that came to a point, and even smaller ears. Her eyes were almond-shaped and slightly upturned. Her fingers were a bit longer and skinnier than they should have been. She was wearing tattered clothes that I didn't think were strange at the time, but now that I think back on it, were almost pilgrim-like. Out of all of this, though, I will never forget her eyes. The iris of her eyes were a shade of gray, so light that they were almost invisible. They were striking, almost ghostly, and when she moved into the shadows cast from the tree, they seemed to glow. I think the term reflect is better. They were reflective like the eyes of a cat or raccoon. Right when I looked into them, the same sense of dread and panic filled me. I began to quiver. "Stop that," she said, with adult authority. You scared me," I said. "Who are you?" "Constance," she answered. She smiled at me, but it was cold. I'd never seen a child like this. "Why are you in the woods?" I asked her. I knew there were bears, and I didn't want her to get hurt. "I live here," she said, as she turned away and skipped through the trees out of sight. I was confused and scared, so I ran back inside to tell my mother. Of course she didn't believe me, and told me that I must have imagined it. I think imagination is a crutch used by parents to explain things away that scare them, especially when it involves children. I remember after I told my mother, she went outside with her rosary and prayed over the yard for a bit, so I knew she must have been a little afraid. Despite telling me it was my imagination, she was still cautious of what I said. That night, as I was trying my best to fall asleep, I heard a tapping on my window. It was around midnight, and when I turned on my lamp, I saw the same girl from the woods just outside my window. She was standing there like she was waiting for me to open it and let her inside. My room was on the second story of the house, and there was nothing there for her to stand on below the window. "What are you doing?" I asked, startled. "Do you want to see my house?" she asked, with the same cold smile. In the light of my lamp, her eyes looked animal-like, hungry. "Get out of here," I said, with as much authority that a scared 8-year-old boy could give. I was very afraid now, and I was beginning to cry. "Tell me I can come in. We can play with your toys and bring them to my house. My family is very nice, but we're awfully hungry." "Get out," I said again. She leaned closer to the window, and that's when I saw her teeth clearly. I'd somehow never noticed them while she spoke, but they seemed to change when she said the word hungry. They were sharp, not like horror movie sharp, but sharp enough to puncture what they bit into. They were all that sharp. My eyes grew wide, and I began to scream for my mother. "Let me in! Let me in!" The girl screamed as she hit my window. I was now screaming in terror as my bedroom door flew open. My mother rushed inside and turned on the light, and there was nothing in my window. I told her what happened, and she said that I probably had a nightmare about the girl. But right as she was saying that, I saw what looked like Constance looking up at me from the tree line. I saw those reflective eyes of hers, then saw 2 more pairs of reflective eyes. Those were at a much higher height than hers, as if they were from adults. While my mother was trying to calm me down, she said that we were going to visit my aunt and cousins the next day. What she didn't tell me was that she had lost the house, and she was actually bringing me to stay with my aunt while she moved our things from the house to our new place. The next day, as we were loading some bags into the trunk, my mother told me that we were going to bring Marcy with us and that I should go get her. I found her in the backyard, snarling into the woods. I called her over, and we quickly ran to the car. As we drove off, I looked back at our old home, and I swear I saw those eyes. 3 pairs of eyes staring at me through the trees. When my mom finally explained that we weren't going back, I was very happy. My mother said I even looked relieved. I'll never forget those eyes. Sometimes I see them in my dreams. I still wonder what would have happened if I had opened the window for Constance, and I still shudder at the thought of being so close to her in my yard. I know that they were vampires. They had to be. The Tower in the Woods, submitted by Julia B. I live in a small rural town in Quebec, Canada. In front of my house, there is a small forest with some really nice trails, and I would often take my dog Sokia for a walk. I would usually take a trail that would go up to a farm and walk it back and forth. One day, I discovered another trail that would bring me back to the end of the normal trail like some sort of loop, and in that new trail, I saw a really cool handmade tower, probably made by some teenagers. All in all, it was a very strange sight to see something like that in the middle of the woods. It had 2 floors and was decorated with some road signs, which made it look even weirder. One day of October 2017, I took my 7-year-old brother out with me for a walk with the dog, because my mother wanted him to go outside instead of playing inside with his tablet all day. So we got out in the woods, and I decided to show him this tower, because I was sure he would like it the same as I did. Unlike any time before, once we arrived at the tower, the whole forest went eerily quiet. But because the tower was new to my brother, I was more focused on his reaction to it. He seemed amazed. We took a few more steps towards the tower, and I noticed the silence. Never before had being in these woods felt so wrong. Something didn't want us there. I hated the feeling, and I wanted to just leave. Trying not to sound scared, I told my brother that it was time to leave. We had to get back home before it started getting dark, and I didn't want him or the dog attempting to climb it, as there were thorns around it, and I didn't want them getting hurt. As we were leaving the place, I started to hear some music coming from inside the tower. And no, it didn't sound like a radio or a CD player or anything like that. Nothing like a teenager would be listening to. Instead, it sounded like an ancient music box, ticking its tunes over a metal cylinder. I was hoping I was just hearing things, but then my brother asked me what was making the music. I didn't want him scared. Again, it would make it easier to go home if we were all calm, or at least if he was calm. So I told him that it was just my phone playing the music, because I probably pressed a button by accident. Then I pulled him along with me, speed walking, trying to get us both away from the tower. I felt like someone or something that was there at the tower was trying to scare us, and it was working. When we got on my usual trail to go back home, my dog stopped right in his tracks and stared into the woods we had just exited in the direction of the tower. I called out to her, told her to keep going, and then I heard the sound of footsteps and branches breaking. The sounds were coming towards us. I was horrified, and I pressed on even harder and faster, telling my brother that we were going to run back home. Make it a race just for fun. I was going to let him win because I wanted to keep an eye on him. As we were running, I started to look around to try to find the person or thing that was pursuing us, and I never saw anything. When I was looking in the general direction of the sounds, my dog was following us, but she would stop sometimes to once again look back into the woods where those sounds were coming from. Usually, she would bark at the sounds from the woods, but all she would do was cock her head to the side and stare as if she was hypnotized or curious as to what they were. As we exit the woods, almost home at last, I hear something clear as day. The low, raspy laughter of an old man coming from the trees. Chills and goosebumps erupted all over my body. I turned in an instant to see what it was, but there was nothing there. Just my dog bursting through the tree line in order to catch up with us. When I told my mother what happened in those woods, she told me that someone was probably playing a prank on us, and that the music was probably just a sensor that we triggered while leaving the tower. But I know what I heard in those woods. I still go back in them to this day with my dogs, but I only take my trail. I want to go see the tower again, but part of me knows, for some reason, some way, the tower won't be there when I go back. Something Among the Birch Woods, submitted by Katerma. I live in eastern Finland, in a small city. Most of the cities here are like openings or holes in a forest, if you look at them down from the sky. In the Finnish folklore, there are many stories of forest creatures and spirits that guard the forests and lead people astray. There are even stories of forest shrouding, where some force confuses a person who is in the woods so that they get lost for years. Some say there is an upside-down world there, where all kinds of wondrous and scary ancient beings live. There are stories of people going into the forest shroud and making it out years later with odd stories to tell. There's this birch forest near my home. A black river streams through it and floods it in the spring. I usually walk the dog in there because I think it's beautiful. Pure birch tree forests aren't that common even in here, and the trees are quite old, some of them huge. Old, full of fungi, and twisted. Sometimes I take the kids there too. My daughter is very sensitive in a way. From an early age she's been seeing and talking to imaginary things, some of them which were odd. For example, my now past grandmother My daughter, she never met her, but often talks to her and about her. One day when we were eating at our dinner table, she just stood up, looked out the window and burst into tears, crying, "Goodbye, Mama." That was the end of the imaginary friend that we thought was my grandmother. It's curious, because I think my daughter kind of reminds me of her too. One time during the day, when we were walking among the birch woods, my daughter creepily said to me there was somebody there. She said it was a dead horse named Lotta. She told me it was very old and lived out here. I laughed at her. I'm just used to these stories from her. I smiled and shrugged and laughed at them, but there was always this weird undertone to her stories. They were fantastic and imaginative, but eerily consistent, like an unconscious hint of a memory. I think she's a smart child with a good imagination, but when she cries at night and I walk into the room to find her sleepwalking and pointing at an empty chair in the middle of the room, it feels uncanny, like there's something between the lines. A couple of months ago, it was a full moon, and I was walking my dog at night. I was going for a walk in the birch forest. The moon painted the frost bluish. As I approached the forest, the birch trees rose from the frozen ground like these white, upside-down ruins, and behind them, just black with hints of more white sides of the trees. It must have been like 100 meters away. I must have been 100 meters away from the house when I heard something from the dark forest. Something heavy was moving around in there, crashing through the trees. Sometimes I've heard the rabbits scream in there when a lynx or a fox gets them. The rabbits scream like a small child when they're being killed. But this was something different. A wild boar, maybe. Maybe a moose. The dog was also interested in the sounds, its ears pointed upwards towards the sky. We walked closer to the white trees and the noises got louder. We both stopped to look. The dog didn't bark, it just pointed its nose towards the sound. As we walked back and made it to about 20 meters away from the tree line, the sounds stopped. For a while, it was just quiet, and then it started again. Something began running in the forest near the tree line, not from us, but towards us. It gives me chills just remembering this, heavy, amazingly fast footsteps. I start to think it was bipedal, according to the sounds it made. It made 20 to 30 meters in only a few seconds. I sat there frozen on uneven forest ground. I looked between the trunks over fallen trees and bushes, thinking, this isn't a human being at all, and it's definitely no moose. My dog's head turned accordingly to the movement as we heard it. And then it stopped, right before us. I felt the darkness staring at me, and I stared back. For sure, I wasn't going in the forest with something in the dark facing towards us. Just to the left of the path I was going to walk to enter the forest, making sounds in front of us, I started to back away from the tree line, never facing away from the sounds. Whatever was in there, it was interested in us, but didn't seem to want to come out of the forest. I wasn't about to turn my back to it, that was for sure. My hands curled into fists. The dog's tail was between its legs as we backed away. The sounds kept going, and I could hear them even from over 100 meters away. It was then that I turned my back on it and began to walk faster. I thought of all the possible forms the darkness could have taken in there if I'd went in, or if I had a flashlight with me. The terror I felt that night was more real than I'd ever felt before. I rushed home and locked the door. Even my wife got nervous seeing me spooked like that. I've been in the forest almost every night since then, walking my dog as usual, but we haven't heard anything like it since. I've always been on high alert since that night. Wondering about what was in there that night might just be better than having found out. I've never seen or heard anything move so fast in the forest before, but then I think of the dead horse my daughter said she saw. I know little children see things, but I also know their interpretations of them might be incorrect. They see more than us adults who have learned to see the world around us in a certain way, but therefore lacking the ability to describe it. Maybe she didn't see a dead horse after all, but something that she couldn't describe in any other way. Maybe a forest spirit from the ancient times, maybe a keeper that sometimes plays games and tricks on those who come into its domain. Or maybe I entered the forest shroud and was close to never returning. Number 1. Something Under the Bridge. Submitted by James C. I'll begin with saying the cliché line I'm sure you're all tired of hearing. I'm a big fan of horror narrations on YouTube and scary stories on Reddit and the like. I love to get scared and listen to everyone's stories and perspectives from around the world. Just part of my morbid curiosity, I suppose. At any rate, the story I'm about to tell you recently came back to me from childhood. To let you know now, it's a little anticlimactic, but I assure you, this story is 100% true. Without further ado, I'm going to turn back the clock and tell you about the thing I encountered under the bridge many years ago. I'm currently in my mid-20s, and I've never shared this story with anyone. Not because I'm afraid of what people may think, but because it only recently came back to me. I grew up in eastern Pennsylvania, in a somewhat quiet suburban area, just off of Interstate 78, which runs right through our area and into New Jersey. When I was young, my brothers and neighborhood friends used to love exploring the small woods and park that were located behind our houses. I must have been around 6 or 7 when we started really exploring the woods in depth. We'd always walk in a line and keep me, the youngest of all of us, in the middle, so I wouldn't get lost. It didn't take long for us to discover the river that would come and go every time it rained. Turns out, we lived right near one of the overflow rivers from the interstate. Every time there was a heavy downpour, the water would drain out from 78 and flow behind our houses and into the larger, well-known river in the area. The path it took went through and around our neighborhood. As kids, this was always fun to run across and play in, especially when it got very shallow or deep, and we were able to swim through it, or just to see who could get across it without falling. Mind you, it was a very calm and at worst maybe chest-height water on a child. Nothing we considered dangerous. But come to think of it, it was probably more dangerous when there wasn't water flowing through it, after all, due to all the large rocks that were placed there when the overflow path was built. My mom used to complain so much when we'd go down there and play. She banned us from going there, but we always went anyway. You know how kids are. She said we would always get so dirty, and it was too dangerous, and told us not to go. However, we didn't listen. One day, me and one of the neighbor kids and one of my brothers were out there exploring after a rainfall, as we usually did after school. On this occasion, we decided to go further than we had before. Why? I'm not sure. We were kids. We all know kids do what they want when they can. When we'd come to the river, we usually would walk to the left. We knew that eventually this would lead to the larger Lehigh River, and it got difficult to walk through the further left we went. This was a perfect coincidence, as much further than that was kind of far from home. This time, however, we all decided to go to the right. There, the water was shallow. It only took some sandals to get through, and we walked up the calm waters until we reached a bridge that we didn't even know existed. From the top of the road as you're driving, this old bridge didn't look like a bridge at all. It blends in very well with the ancient surroundings, nor does it have anything above it construction-wise. It literally looks like a forgotten road on a hill. Anyway, we come to this bridge, and we discover that underneath is all cement and flat, which made it perfect to splash and fool around in. There were several pipes and tunnels that were much too small for any person to enter, with the exception of one. There was one very big tunnel, I would call it, that if you bent over, you could actually walk through. We come to this opening, kind of dumbfounded that it's here. Before now, we didn't even know this bridge existed, and now there's a concrete tunnel we're all capable of walking through. So of course, as curious kids do, we all wanted to explore it. When we looked down into the tunnel, we could see daylight streaming in from the surface. The water drains located on the road that extended in the same direction created a kind of skylight effect and let a small amount of light in. Creepy thing was, it just got so inexplicably dark past the last grate, obviously from the lack of sunlight. We took turns and as groups walked in the tunnel as far as we could, but kept wussing out and marking our distance with chalk. We decided to return the following day with my dad's deer spotter to see how far this dark tunnel actually went. The three of us came back the following afternoon. The water had dried up in most spots, and we brought our razor scooters to try some tricks in the smooth, flat concrete under the bridge. We liked to hang out down there as it was completely cool and shaded and welcomed all crosswinds from either side. I remember how bright this flashlight was that my dad had. Not really sure why he had it to begin with, but he did. So we took it to the big tunnel and shined it on down. Surprisingly, this light reached its limit, and we weren't able to see anything past the beam it gave off. I know it was daytime, but we were underground in a dark concrete tunnel. Surely, it should have hit something. I remember taking turns yet again, going in as far as we could go. The thing is, any slight sound made inside this tunnel causes so much confusion and echoing. Words spoken by someone right behind or in front of you became nearly indiscernible because of the countless echoes. Steps sounded like they were coming from all over. It was very disorienting and a bit creepy when you can't identify where the sounds are coming from, let alone what they are. I remember attempting to communicate with them and not being able to understand each other at all. So eventually, we would go in and not talk because it made it easier to do in the quiet. This is so long ago that I can't remember why, but my brother must have been picking on me at the time, something he did often as he's the middle child. If I had to guess, I'd say he was calling me a baby for not being able to go all the way down the tunnel with the flashlight, even though none of them could do any better. The neighbor girl must have been on his side too, and this made me more upset. All I remember is storming off for home by myself, leaving the two of them behind. They were the same age and often ganged up on me when I didn't do everything they wanted me to. Later, when I went back outside, I saw my brother and the neighbor girl outside my house, hanging out like they always did. They again teased me for leaving and told me that they both made it to the end of the tunnel. My brother, who loved to lie out of spite, told me they made it all the way back and found a big metal door. He said they tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The neighbor girl was raised very well about things like lying, so she didn't say anything at all. She neither confirmed nor denied my brother's made-up story. She just stood there and let him tell it. So of course I didn't believe him. To this day I still don't. Fast forward probably a month or two. That neighbor girl had moved away, and my older brothers didn't want to go outside as much anymore, as technology became the predominant entertainment source for them. So I decided to go out on my own. I somehow ended up back at this bridge with the big concrete tunnel, which, by the way, I assume was for highway drainage and probably gushed out gallons of water after it rained, although I never saw it doing so. It would explain why a small child could simply walk through it, and an adult could easily crawl or crouch their way through it as well. I came to the old test of courage. No flashlight, no equipment. Just wanted to ride my razor around on the smooth concrete as I had just got new tires for it. And if anyone else grew up with razors, you know those tires wore down pretty fast. I remember it being really quiet when I was down there alone. Every sound I made echoed so loudly off the bridge and inside the tunnel. Curious, as I always was and still am, I went up to the tunnel and again tried to look down it. I went in maybe 5 to 10 feet, near the one open grate to see the sunlight and the road above. It was so quiet. Now, remember how I said the tunnel was disorienting when it comes to sound due to its terrible acoustics? Well, I maybe took another few steps forward, and that's when I heard it. Clearly, as if someone was only standing a few feet in front of me, and as if we weren't in some dark tunnel. Clear as day, I heard an old creepy voice scoff and say,
A human.
I froze in my tracks. Alone, inside this tunnel, I couldn't see anything in front of me. It felt like it went on for 15 minutes, but only could have been a few seconds of silence. Then, with ice in my veins, I snapped out of it. I turned around and booked it back to the bridge, grabbed my scooter, and ran up to the main road. Normally, I would have taken the river path home, as it's shaded and much safer. That's always how we would go to the bridge, and my parents forbade me riding my scooter on any street that wasn't ours. Not today, Satan, I thought. I got out of there so fast, I remember frantically climbing the rocks along the side of the road until I hit the top, hopped on my scooter, and sped home, not daring to look back even once. Present day, when this story came back to me, I brought it up to my mother. She got real quiet, which wasn't like her. She asked me if I remember how she never wanted us playing down there. I told her yes. Originally, she had claimed because we would get dirty or hurt, and to this day, my mom hates dirt. She always has, so I never questioned it. She then proceeded to tell me the real reason she didn't want us going down there. Apparently, a local child disappeared playing in the river one day. She never told us because she didn't want us to get scared or freak out or be scared of the area we lived in. It suddenly made sense why she would get so angry when she could tell we were playing in that river if we came home slightly wet or muddy. Keep in mind, I was around for the birth of the internet. This happened long before that time, before dial-up was a thing. So kids, teens, and young adults didn't really have a way to be in touch with local news, except for what the rumor mills were turning out. The boy who disappeared was a well-kept secret. They searched for a while, but his body never turned up. Nothing, as if he vanished without a trace, as if he was taken. What was it, you might be wondering? Was there a correlation between the kid who went missing and the thing that exists under the bridge? I don't have a clue. All I know for sure, and still remember to this day, is that crystal clear voice I heard down in that tunnel. Could it have been the wind? Could it have been my imagination? Could it have been a troll who lives under the bridge by my house and eats children? At this point, all explanations are possible to me. I just know for a fact what I heard, and given the acoustics of that tunnel, makes it so hard to explain. It chills me to this day to know there had to be someone or something in that dark tunnel with me, just beyond where the lights reached, hiding in the darkness, waiting for its next victim, referring to me as human. You couldn't drag me back there. The Odor by Anon. My mom works at a local hospital, and I get to hear a lot of interesting stories from her coworkers. This story is from one of the nurses she works with. A morbidly obese woman came into the doctor's office one day, complaining of a horrible odor coming from her that she could not get rid of. She told the doctor that she bathes regularly and maintains her hygiene well, so she could not figure out why she stank. The doctor told the nurse to give the woman a sponge bath to try to figure out where the odor was coming from. The nurse did so and went through and cleaned every fold and crevice of the woman's body. But once she reached her abdomen, the nurse had to lift and fold and clean all the folds of her skin. Finally, the nurse lifted a particular fold and was met with a nauseating, overpowering stench. Under her fat was a green, mushy, and moldy, unrecognizable object. That was obviously the source of the odor, and in fact, the skin underneath had been terribly infected. When asked to identify the object, the woman, embarrassed, confessed it was an old piece of bread. Apparently, the woman was using pieces of bread to dab away the sweat she had under her folds, as she was too lazy to get up to get a rag, and her folds would get sore if she didn't do something. A piece had gotten lodged in between her fat folds for God knows how long. It is truly beyond me how she could just lose that piece of bread, and why she just had to use bread in the first place. I just hope that lady has learned from this unfortunate and rather grotesque experience. Nighttime Creepers by Jessica. This happened late one night during my Christmas break from school. Now, my bedroom window is already a bit cracked, and it causes my room to be extra cold during the winter. I had just finished watching some YouTube videos, when suddenly something began scraping against this window, scraping and tapping. I paused my video and looked over to it. There was nothing there, and the sound had stopped. I started to relax again and unpaused my YouTube video. My white cat suddenly jumped onto the bed with me, nearly making me jump out of my skin. As I was watching the videos, I realized my cat was no longer looking around. Instead, she was looking beyond me toward the window. She wasn't blinking, and her hair was standing on end slowly. Now, seeing her do this, I knew I had to peer out the window myself, but I was going to do it in an instant. I wanted to catch what she was looking at. So, despite goosebumps enveloping my entire body, I counted down in my head. 3, 2, 1. I turned around, catching a glimpse of a pale face peeking in through the window. It was only after I began screaming that I saw its pale fingers up against the window beside it. It was staring in at me, whatever inhuman thing this was. When my parents ran in and the figure had already disappeared, I told them what I saw. They went outside to look around, and I actually went with them, feeling a bit brave cowering behind my father. All we discovered were footprints, bare footprints, in the snow. Something or someone had been there, and I can only pray that what I saw was nothing but a mask. Please let it be a mask. Whoa, that was creepy. After all these stories, I'm sure you're gonna have loads of nightmares. If not, 2019 is here now, and I've got way too many stories yet to tell. So subscribe, leave a like on this video, and comment below with what you want to hear this year. Thanks for tuning in. I'll be back to my regular uploads soon, which means more of me replying to your comments at the end of videos as well. Until then, stay safe out there, and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.